Good evening. My name is Michael Robinson, and I'm the faculty director of the Master of Real Estate Development program at Auburn University. I'd like to welcome all of you to our annual City Builders Symposium. City Builders is an industry outreach initiative of the Master of Real Estate Development program. This executive graduate degree offering is a unique joint venture between the Raymond J. Harbert College of Business and the College of Architecture, Design, and Construction. As advertised, tonight we will be discussing the future of urban trails and real estate development. It's a perfect example of the powerful admixture of design and business principles that drive our graduate program forward. My many years of professional experience in landscape architecture and urban design suggest that urban trails are not naturally occurring events in the urban or ex-urban fabric of our country. The magic that you will learn about tonight is the product of resilient efforts of many community leaders, civic activists, environmentalists, and other groups who have created, after long decades of work, the necessary forward motion to allow these cross-community connections to both appear and to thrive. I'm therefore eager to hear the stories of the trail discussions this evening and to learn how they have captured the attention and imagination of the developers, investors, government entities, and business interests. Before we begin tonight, I would like to offer my sincere thanks to the executive teams of the Harbert College of Business, the College of Architecture, Design, and Construction, and the Media Production Group for their diligent efforts in putting this virtual symposium together. I also wanted to thank our premier and supporting sponsors for helping make this event possible. And of course, I want to especially thank all of our panelists for sharing their knowledge and experience with us tonight. Now let me introduce our moderator for the evening, Mr. Greg Winchester. Greg is the founder and CEO of Summit Investors, and to our great benefit, Greg also holds the position of adjunct professor of real estate development and head of industry and alumni relations for our program. Greg, I'll turn the program over to you now.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome everyone to our second annual City Builders Symposium, the future of urban trails and real estate development. I want to thank also, as Michael mentioned, all of our sponsors, and particularly our premier sponsors, who are Raymond James, Synovus, TerraCap, and Trimont Real Estate Advisors. Without you, this event would not be possible. I have the distinct pleasure tonight to introduce the moderator for our Urban Trails panel, Jennifer Pharr Davis. Jennifer is a trailblazer. She is a record-setting hiker who's covered over 14,000 miles of long-distance trails, which have taken her into the remote backcountry wilderness, as well as cities and towns across the globe. She's woven her adventures into a career as an author and speaker, and uses her voice to remind everyone that we are all a part of nature. In 2012, Jennifer was recognized as a National Geographic Adventurer of the Year, and she currently serves on the President's Council for Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition. She lives with her family in Asheville, North Carolina, where she owns and operates Blue Ridge Hiking Company. Jennifer, thank you for joining us at our symposium tonight, and I'll turn the podium over to you.
Thanks, Greg. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Trail Builders panel. My name is Jennifer Pharr Davis, and I will be your moderator. John Muir once said that in every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks. Perhaps our trail leader panelists might add that in every trail building project, one receives far more challenges and opportunities than they may seek. More and more, we hear about the benefits and importance of trails, especially for those living in urban areas. They are significant for mental and physical health. They provide green space and protect wildlife corridors, and they allow people to commute on foot or bike to access work, shops, and services. Urban trails also increase property value, attract tourism, and spur economic growth. The members on our Trail Leaders panel have helped to plan, implement, and protect urban trail networks across the Southeast. And in doing so, they have faced challenges, created solutions, and succeeded in providing invaluable resources to the communities they serve. Tonight, they are here to share their experience, their victories, and maybe even some of their mistakes. To begin, I will ask each panelist to briefly introduce themselves and provide an overview of their current projects. We will start with Kathy Cook.
Thank you, Jennifer, and I'm so happy to be a part of this panel. I work for the City of Alpharetta. Worked for the City of Alpharetta for 30 years as Economic Development Director now and Community Development Director. And our current project is an urban trail, which is the Alpha Loop. We have about 2 miles of the 8-mile section completed, and we look forward to connecting that to our Greenway, which was built in 1995.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathy. Next, we'll hear from George Dusenberry.
Jennifer, my name is George Dusenberry. I am the Georgia State Director for the Trust for Public Land. We're a national organization who builds parks and preserves land for people. We celebrate our 50th anniversary next year. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary here in Atlanta this year. When I talk about our Georgia work, our Southeast work, I really highlight our work in terms of helping to create the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site, but also our work on the Atlanta Beltline, where we help create the green space vision for it and actually acquired $47 million worth of land to get it going in its early years. And also our Chattahoochee River work, where we have preserved 18,000 acres and 80 miles of riverfront along the Chattahoochee. And that's our big project. We are focusing right now on building a 100-mile Blueway Greenway trail that extends from Lake Lanier through the heart of metropolitan Atlanta and down to Chattahoochee Bend State Park. Thank you for having me.
That sounds awesome. Thank you, George. Next up, Aaron Fortner.
All right, now I can talk. Aaron Fortner, I'm a principal and owner of the Canvas Planning Group. Do master planning and zoning code writing, urban design work for cities and counties throughout the Southeast. Currently working with City of LaGrange, Georgia to write zoning, rewrite their zoning ordinance to fit their new trail system to activate the development patterns that they want to see on their urban trail system. But have done previous planning with other trail systems and excited to be a part of tonight.
Cool, Aaron, we are glad to have you. And our next panelist is Clyde Higgs.
So good evening. Thank you for that introduction. So my name is Clyde Higgs. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Atlanta Beltline, Inc. ABI is a single purpose organization with roughly 50 people. And all we do is thinking about delivering on the Atlanta Beltline vision, which is a very comprehensive redevelopment project focused on trail, transit, affordable housing, economic development, job creation, and green space development. And so happy to be here and look forward to elaborating on some of the questions.
Clyde, thanks for making time for us. Next up, we have someone coming from Charlotte, North Carolina, Beth Poovey.
Hi, thank you. So I'm Beth Poovey, and I am a landscape architect at Land Design, which is a landscape architecture, urban design, and civil engineering firm. In Land Design, I lead the public open space studio, which focuses on trails, greenways, parks, and small town development. We have worked on several projects up and down the coast. Within Charlotte, the Cross Charlotte Trail, the Carolina Thread Trail, and Little Sugar Creek Greenway, which has, so my clients tend to be either a park and rec department or the Department of Transportation or Public Works or city managers. So they all have very different perspectives, but look forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks, Beth. And last but not least, we have Becca Zajac.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Rebecca Zajac. I am the Executive Director of the Dragonfly Trails, which is the off-road greenway trails in Columbus, Georgia. We currently have just over 30 miles of trails built. We have about another 35 planned. Our trail system is primarily used for recreation, transportation, and connecting people to destinations and also connecting people to one another.
Great. Thank you all. Now we're going to begin our moderator-led Q&A. After each question, I will queue up one of the panelists to start the discussions, and everyone will have the opportunity to share their thoughts if they want. So to get started, there are many benefits when it comes to urban trails. Recreation opportunities, transportation corridors, increased property values, economic stimulus, conservation and sustainability, and community building and connection, like Becca just mentioned. What do you see as the biggest benefit of urban trails to your community? And we'll start this question with Kathy Cook.
Thank you. I think the biggest benefit is community building. And it's people are living in their subdivisions, and I think that the trails give them a place to connect. So I think the social connections that are created is the biggest benefit. I mean, there's many other benefits, but I think for us that's big, to bring people back to where they are socially connecting.
Our other panelists are welcome to jump in, or you're welcome to raise your hand physically or using the Zoom feature, and I can call on you if you prefer. Clyde, why don't you go next?
Sure, that's a fair question, but I will say for us, you love all your kids the same, and but there are a couple of things that I will highlight for the Beltline, and it really is, and I think Kathy touched on this, but this connectivity, this focus on community and residents is kind of where we're living and really producing outcomes that are going to be beneficial to community. And so we really look at our trail network as an opportunity, again, to spur economic development, creating jobs where people live, and then obviously giving people transportation options to get to amenities and resources. But all of those things that you mentioned really create, that special dish of gumbo. I shared with you that I lived on the Gulf Coast, and so my frame of reference is food often. But when you think about gumbo is great with rice. It's great because it has sausage, it has shrimp, oysters, okra, but together it makes something special, and that's really how we look at the Beltline project.
Thanks. Beth.
Thanks. I think it's an interesting question to think about over time. I think that I agree, all of those things are very true to be values of trails and urban trails. But I think that who you're talking to and what the issues are of your community at that time really help frame that discussion of value. So when we start in the Southeast thinking about that, a lot of the trails started with the benefit of recreation and health and wellness, and how important it is to be able to get out. Then it changed to economic development. At least here in Charlotte, economic development was the thing that sold trails, right? You could get funding if you talked about the value that they created in terms of economic development. But we're seeing now, and this time, COVID time, it's not only health and wellness, but also social equity. That how can trails serve the value of breaking down some of the barriers that we've created through our planning and urban design. And so that is really the value that we are really talking about, at least in the Charlotte region today.
Thanks, Beth. Becca?
Now, I would add, I completely agree with Beth. I think how and why we started building trails in Columbus is very different from how and why we build them today. And specifically in Columbus, our poverty rate is higher than most cities in Georgia. And our public transportation system is not the most reliable thing. And as we dive deeper into executing our master plan and getting community input, we are recognizing that people are using our trails for transportation more than anything. And creating, I think, from when we started to where we are today, shifting our mindset to create better access and equitable access is really driving where we put our trails more than it ever has before. And I think I may have shared this with you when we spoke a few days ago, but in Columbus, there's a high rate of people who do not have vehicles, not even a single vehicle in their house. And so shifting our goals as an organization to address those needs has really risen to the top.
Thanks, Becca. Any other thoughts from additional panelists before we move on? Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the flip side of that. There are many challenges when it comes to urban trails, including funding, community buy-in, planning, safety, maintenance, and many more. So what is the biggest obstacle you have faced with your work in urban trails, and what strategies have you used to manage or overcome that obstacle? To start us off, George, could you speak on this?
I'd be glad to. I think, the trails are challenged in terms of their long linear in their nature. And so that means is you have a lot of different property owners you need to deal with in terms of making that happen. Now, Clyde, the Atlanta Beltline, has benefited in part for having an existing rail corridor that you can work for. So it's always great to have that rail corridor you can build along. But absent that, getting control of the land, and that means convincing a lot of landowners that this trail is actually a benefit and not something that is somehow scary. And so I think for us, that has been the biggest challenge. And what's been great is that there's been just a preponderance of so many successful trails out there that you could point to it. And there were people who may have opposed the Atlanta Beltline, who may have opposed the Alpha Loop or the Big Creek Greenway or all these projects, and be able to take them out there, show them that, and show them how it's successful and benefit from it is great. But you still have that kind of not in my backyard resistance. And you have a bit of, you have oftentimes a lot of property owners you need to deal with to get control of the land.
Thanks, George. Beth?
Thank you. I definitely agree that we definitely face lots of issues with property acquisition. But another one, which I think is interesting with this panel to pose, is actually working with developers. That is it can be a very complicated process and brings up a lot of different things to think about. I'm fortunate at Land Design that I do my clients are all public sector clients, but my colleague who will be on later, Richard Petersheim, works with the developers. So I get to set the guidelines and then he has to figure out how to make it work. So we have a lot of dialogue back and forth about, is it fair what you're asking for? Is it not fair? So I would say that working with developers is a very interesting thing, but figuring out what tools you have to incentivize is, I think, a very interesting topic. And so all of our trails have been looked at recently to have developer contributions and having a set of tools in your community that you can use to help incentivize getting a trail built and designed the way that you envision it.
Thanks, Beth. Aaron?
Yeah, I think, the challenges could be multifaceted and also be a nature of what kind of trail system is being proposed. Is it behind people's houses? Is it taking a lane out of a street and people are concerned about, losing road capacity? So I think the concerns and challenges can come from different angles. But what I've found in terms of success and overcoming those obstacles is the first thing I like to do is take stakeholders to a place where a trail system exists, because a lot of the communities I work in, they don't have these systems. And so we load everybody up on the buses. We did this in Opelika, actually, just a few years ago, brought everybody to Atlanta and showed them different trail systems so that the leadership and the stakeholders could see it, and it's more familiar, and they see how positive it is, how successful it is. And then the second thing I'd like to try to do to help make these things happen in a community is to get a sample project, a prototype project going in that community. Oftentimes in a community that the larger trail system plan won't get traction until a small segment of it can be shown as a sample project. Now, I know that's not easy to do all the time, because even a sample extension of a trail system can be expensive. But I've noticed in the communities where they can just do the first go of it, the phase one of it, and a prototype of it, that once people in that community then can walk it and see it, they get really excited about it. And that can really open up the rest of the pathway towards building of the future segments and the broader vision of a trail system.
I heard from many of the panelists in our pre-panel correspondences that successful trails mean more successful trails. And several of you in particular referenced the Beltline. If you can talk about the Beltline and the positive benefits and impacts it's had for the city of Atlanta, all of a sudden your community responds positively to urban trails as well. So Clyde, can you talk about some of the biggest challenges you faced with the Beltline?
Sure. So one of the things that the Beltline is blessed with is that it really started as a grassroots effort within the city of Atlanta. And so this did not come from just one single individual. Ryan Gravel, Mayor Franklin at the time, and many others really kind of coalesced this idea, but it was really a community led effort. And so we've always enjoyed this significant community support behind the Beltline. We actually had a community survey recently, and it showed that, we had somewhere, 80+% favorability rating within the city of Atlanta, and just deeming it very worthy of public investment. And so again, we are blessed with that swell of support. And the reason we have that support is because our project is so multifaceted. Mm-hmm. So obviously we have the trail component, which I think sometimes is considered perhaps the leading star of the Beltline show. But we also have a significant piece and thrust on transit, affordable housing, job creation, parks development. And so you can imagine that allows multiple inputs from people that support us for the Beltline. But on the flip side of that, you can imagine when it's time to resource, those various buckets, then you also hear from specific advocacy groups on, hey, I want my piece of the pie, above everything else. Right. And so perhaps our biggest challenge is making sure that we keep the coalition together and saying that this is truly a comprehensive redevelopment project. And so all of those things are important. And so when we're talking to the affordable housing advocates, or we're talking to the trail advocates, or the transit advocates, we're trying to keep that coalition all together and making sure that we deliver on all of those goals, not just one specific bucket of Beltline responsibility.
Yes, there are a lot of players at the table for all of these trails, and it is difficult to keep everyone at any table happy. So that is certainly a challenge, and communicating is huge. Becca, or I think Kathy, would either of you like to talk about the challenges that you all face with your projects?
Sure, I'll go ahead. I think funding, everybody's mentioned funding, but what Alpharetta has is we have an impact fee ordinance. So we've had a lot of success with working with the development community, a lot of buy-in. In fact, with the Greenway that was built and started in 1995, that was mostly built by developers. And then the 8 Mile Alpha Loop section that we're working on, over 2 miles has already been built by the development community. And there's been a huge buy-in. It's something where, if you're going to pay the city $6,700 per residential unit and you have 100 units, are you going to pay, how much you're able to get so much more done if you take that $670,000 and actually build a trail on your development. So a lot of buy-in by doing that, because they not only build the trail section, but they add to it. You'll see that they'll, go ahead and add dog parks, that at their own cost, more landscaping. So that is something that has been a huge tool for us to be able to use.
Cool. Thank you. Becca, anything to add?
Yeah, I think we, what's interesting in this is the Dragonfly Trails was really created as a way to overcome some of the challenges the city was having with building trails. So we're a nonprofit. We are in a public-private partnership with the city of Columbus. We help do all of the design, engineering, get the entire plan ready, obviously with a ton of community input, the city's input. And we, kind of give them a package where they go out and bid it. And historically, since our organization has been around, which has just been a few years, they have funded the actual construction of the trail. Dragonfly Trails was built to overcome, we had two major trails that were not connected by a mile for something like 20 years. And so civic leaders in our community recognized that these needed to be connected. Why weren't they connected? Okay, the city doesn't have the right resources lined up to do this, and it wasn't a priority at that time. And so we were created, and we made that connection, and now we're continuing to execute our master plan. But funding is an issue for us, and again, we cannot be just dependent on the city anymore, and that's why we were created, to go out and find private funding, federal funding, state funding. So I would say definitely from a small nonprofit perspective, funding is a major challenge for us. But as we've all alluded to, when you sort of build this critical mass of people who see the trails getting done little by little, they start asking about trails in their area, and there's a large or a greater buy-in. And having the Atlanta Beltline is an incredible way to just, we have literally shuttled developers in buses up to Atlanta and spent a day on the Beltline and just help them imagine what it what our city could look like and how we could implement some of the strategies they're doing there in Columbus. And we are really lucky, actually. I believe 2 developers from Columbus are on the second panel, who have been great advocates in their developments for putting little spurs that connect to our main trail, which is the Riverwalk. And again, our role is to get with economic developers as soon as we hear a project is going in, and try to articulate why they should consider connecting to a trail or building a trail that may connect to our major system at a later date. But I loved what Kathy said about an incentive program. That's something I think is incredible if we could implement in our city or other cities around Georgia.
Yeah, it's great to see how these trails feed and support other trails. The Beltline has been tremendous. I live in Asheville, North Carolina. I know that Asheville has looked at cities like Alpharetta or Greenville at their trail system to implement similar things in our master plan. So it certainly seems like successful trails bring more successful trails. And speaking of public-private partnership, I want to take a moment just to clarify that all our panelists tonight are speaking as individuals, and they represent the groups who they work for. The slide backgrounds are our symposium sponsors. So they are not affiliated with the individuals who are speaking, but we're very grateful for the sponsors for making this symposium possible. So we are happy to represent them, although there is no necessarily affiliation between the background and the panelist. So with that being said, on to the next question. There is overwhelming data to highlight the significant impact of urban trails connected to increased real estate prices, tourism, and economic opportunities. Can you provide specific examples of how you have seen urban trails increase economic stimulus in your community? Aaron, can you start us off?
All right, sorry. Yeah, I mean, that's something that everywhere where they've been done, it eventually leads to, the Beltline is the best example. Before that, in Atlanta was the Freedom Park Trail system, which is the neighborhoods of Candler Park and Inman Park. There were years ago when trails were starting to get built in Atlanta, there were some who felt like that the trails would actually decrease property values. And now in Atlanta, no one really says that. Because of 20 years of really building in-town trails in Atlanta, people are now saying the opposite. So yeah, I do feel like that's for sure what we're seeing in Atlanta and what you're seeing nationally. And because of that, though, many communities now, they're planning trails, and the Beltline is a good example of this. And affordability and tools for preventing extreme gentrification are actually now starting to become part of what's just necessary trail planning, because we know it leads to economic development, and that's really not in doubt anymore. And because of it, now we're starting to to just know good trail planning also comes with, okay, how are we going to maintain affordability? That's work that's just being done that I've been a part of in LaGrange, Georgia as well. A very poor community for the most part. And there's a citywide trail system, but they know, because they've been observing Atlanta for the last 5 years building the Beltline, that they have to have an affordable housing strategy to go with it. So yeah, I think that is clear that that's happening. And now communities are trying to get ahead of the results of the impact of that.
That's great. Are there other examples, specific examples of economic stimulus based off the trail systems that our other panelists are involved with?
I can bring up one. I think hotels, of course, we look at the numbers with the hotels to see how full they are during the week. And our hotels, we have 30 of them, and they've always been at high occupancy during the week. But once we started really marketing our Greenway, of course, the Alpha Loop, you see that now you have the weekend trips. So it's been great, for tourism, and we expect that to continue, especially even when the office comes back. If they stay, Monday through Thursday, then maybe they'll stay for the weekend too, to use the trail. And then I would say the other direct benefit we have seen is with the redevelopment of a suburban mall that we have, North Point, which is about 600 acres, a little over 200 acres of parking. But in 2018, we developed a concept plan that showed the multi-use trails connecting to the existing Greenway. And since we showed that plan, we've already had $300 million worth of reinvestment and permitting the last year, 2020, of course, kind of slowed that down, and now it's back and they're finishing. But to take that model where you have a suburban mall area and old retail shopping centers and show those connections for the trail, it's been huge for redevelopment.
And Jennifer, I will just say, and Aaron touched on in Atlanta, but I do love to share this as an economic developer. So we have invested roughly $650 million into the Beltline to date, just roughly, and we have seen over close to $7 billion in private investment follow the Beltline. And so that's a 10-to-1, roughly 10-to-1 return on investment, which is significant. And so we'll see how that proves out when we finish the rest of the 15 miles that we're responsible for. But there is a balance to that, just making sure that as you see that development and that investment, that you have sophisticated tools in place to make sure that you are taking care of legacy residents that have been in those communities for a long time. And so that's one of the things that I think we've gotten smarter, over the last, 3 or 4 years of the Beltline. And let's be honest, no one predicted that the Beltline would be this wild of an economic success when we first started. And Aaron touched on this a little bit, but when the Beltline was first created, people were like, I don't know if I want a trail running through, my business. That doesn't even make sense. And now you have a complete reversal of that. The traditional back doors of these businesses have now shifted their entryways closer to the Beltline. And so things and mindsets have changed, but it is great to hear that organizations and individuals that are thinking about trail development now are thinking about it holistically, because you cannot develop trails in isolation in a vacuum. You really have to think about what's going to be helpful to community, and again, those residents that have been there for a long time.
And we will have a follow-up question that will address that, and you might want to expand even further on those thoughts, Clyde. Becca, what would you like to add?
I was just going to quickly add the Riverwalk, which is the 13-mile linear trail that parallels the Chattahoochee River. It was actually originally built to as the most beautiful utility road probably in the world to cover our to address and cover our sewer system. And anybody who grew up in Columbus, from what I'm told, is, they really didn't want to be near the river. It wasn't something you would ever think about going in or staring at. And after the Riverwalk was built in 1992, we saw an incredible amount of development that happens to this day. I think we added up the numbers and something almost like $1 billion. And we are continuing to see, not just in our downtown core, where there's probably a mile stretch of the Riverwalk that has developed over the last 5 years. We're seeing that move north and south as well. And, you know, I think a majority of those developers and those businesses would say the reason why they are open is why they chose to open in that area is not only because of the view of the Chattahoochee River, but also the trail and having the Riverwalk features there.
Thanks, Becca. George?
Thank you. Yeah, there's a bigger picture also in terms of the value of trails, not just specifically adjacent to the trails, but a lot of our cities are competing for residents. We're competing for businesses, not just in America, but globally in the case of Atlanta. And so when we've been pushing forward with this Chattahoochee Riverlands vision for this 100-mile greenway, we've had interest from the Georgia Chamber of Commerce and Metro Chamber of Commerce because they see it as a recruiting tool in terms of bringing people to Metro Atlanta, you know, talent. In addition to corporations, people can live wherever they want to nowadays. As we've learned through this pandemic, you can pretty much zoom in from anywhere. And so I think that's a very important thing to consider, is that the economic repercussions is not just specific to where the trail is, but it reverberates throughout the community. And for that reason, you should see that public investment in trails and parks.
Awesome. Any other comments?
I do want to add one thing. You know, I think design and the details matter in this conversation. It's similar in my mind to parks. We all have seen plenty of parks and open spaces that don't lead to economic development. They're not a catalyst for improvement in an area. It's just a park. It's not designed to do anything bigger. And trails can be the same thing. And so for anyone listening, I just think it's important to know that it's not just a widget to plug and play that, oh, I want economic development, let's get a trail in. The detail on how you execute, bring it to life, and how it's designed, and how you really make it a place for people. Just like a great park, there's design and details for what makes it really great for people and what makes it a catalyst for economic development. So design is super, super important. I'm an urban designer, so I have to say that.
Yeah. Thanks for adding that, Erin. So this next question is very tied to what we were just talking about, but with the increased economic benefits of urban trails also come challenges associated with gentrification, affordable housing, and protecting the cultural and historical fabric of nearby neighborhoods. What has been your experience with these issues, and how has your trail project addressed them? And Clyde, we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, sure. That is a really important topic. And again, I'm just glad that we're having this expanded discussion, you know, beyond the physical infrastructure, because at the end of the day, it really is about people, about community. And when you think about Atlanta, you know, I've lived here for roughly 6 years now. I moved here from Charlotte, North Carolina. And Atlanta and the cultural vibrancy that this city has, it's one of our superpowers. And so when you think about all the announcements that you've seen regarding Microsoft, Google, I mean, you name any high-flying company that wants to come to Atlanta, it is in large part because of our culture, you know, the young people, the creativity that the city has. And so making sure that we have sophisticated tools to make sure that Atlanta kind of remains, you know, this cultural hub, and the people that make it a cultural hub, you know, have been in this city for a long time. And so when we develop this infrastructure, these trails, you know, making sure that we do it in a respectful, honorable way that allows people that have, you know, held these communities down for many generations can also thrive when this new investment comes into place. And so we have learned, again, over the years and become much more sophisticated in this gentrification conversation and affordable housing. And but I do need to again give a shout out to the folks that framed the Beltline in the early days for even thinking about affordable housing 15, 16 years ago, when it didn't feel as dire perhaps as it does today. And so our sister organization recently stood up what we call a legacy retention fund, which essentially is a fund. It's actually supported by Bank of America and Georgia Power that will pay the rising property values that legacy residents see when the Beltline is coming through that neighborhood. And so if they were paying, let's say, $100 a year kind of pre-Beltline, and now that the Beltline is coming through, you know, that property tax bill jumps up to $600 a year, then this fund will pay the difference in what that base year property tax value was versus when the Beltline is coming through. And so those are some of the creative things that we're trying to put into place. So again, that people that have been in those communities for a long time can thrive and take advantage of this new investment that we call the Beltline. And then also, we were really excited that we announced our largest land purchase ever for housing affordability and job creation along the Beltline. And this was 31 acres in the Bankhead, Weston Heights neighborhood of Atlanta. It was about a $25 million transaction. We had a developer, property owner that sold this to us for a discount just because they believed in the vision of the Beltline and making sure that we can get ahead of housing affordability. But that area of town is really a target for investment. And so this is where Microsoft has secured 90 acres of land. And so it is going to be ripe for private investment. And so making sure that we had a significant site in that neighborhood that then we can then exact housing affordability, job creation, and green space opportunities was really key for us. So we're definitely getting better at this community building, affordable housing thrust.
Yeah, that is great to know about the legacy fund as well. It sounds like you all are being very proactive about these issues. What other panelists would like to contribute? Beth?
I'm going to share with you a lesson learned back from Charlotte. I think Clyde is right. I think that the Atlanta Beltline has gotten a lot of things right, especially with it being thinking about housing, affordable housing. And so in Charlotte, I don't know if you know, but it is like one of the top ranked cities, or has been top ranked cities in terms of not low economic mobility. So, you know, you're born in an economic situation that you stay in, which is a very serious thing that we have learned a lot from in Charlotte and making a lot of strides. When we were doing the Cross Charlotte Trail, though, one of the goals as a consultant, one of the goals that we were asked by the city to do was to consider social equity and thinking about trails as public infrastructure. Just like everyone deserves a road, everyone deserves to have access to water, all the utilities that we typically use, same as a trail. It is a piece of our infrastructure. And so how do you plan your alignment of a trail to make sure that you're connecting to not only increase property values in some areas and create development opportunities and economic development, but how do you align a trail so that you can reach populations that don't have access to cars or public transportation? So that alignment of the Cross Charlotte Trail actually did go through, was planned to go through a neighborhood that was economically challenged. And when we were doing the planning and the outreach for that project, neighbors came to the public meetings and they were looking at all the different alignments that we had. And they were like, well, we know you're not going to put it through our neighborhood because you never put anything in our neighborhood that's good. And it turned out we had HRNA advisors on our team and they did the economics, and it really did make sense because it reached a large population that went directly into our job center, which is downtown Charlotte. So that trail alignment went through this neighborhood. The next, when we went to go implement the trail, which in this neighborhood, it changed, and then folks were saying, we don't want this because of gentrification. And there was it's really important. I think it does get complicated to make sure that you have a policy in place, but in hindsight, that meeting would have run much better if someone else from housing authority was there. There was more people, and we don't think about it just as a trail. We do need to think about the bigger picture, and all the different departments that can come in and help make these conversations with communities better. But I do really, really think it's so important to think about it as infrastructure, and that everyone has a right to the infrastructure.
That's a great point. Thanks, Beth. Any other thoughts? I would encourage all our listeners. We are working through a list of questions that we came up with based off pre-panel conversations, but I encourage any listeners that might have questions about any topic that we're discussing, go ahead and put those in the Q&A box, because we will be opening it up to audience-based questions in the near future. Before we do, we have a few more on our list. The next thing on our list of questions is that, and it's somewhat related, the communities that our trail leaders here represent and work with are some of the most diverse in the nation. As such, many of our panelists have worked very intentionally on matters of accessibility and equal access to trails, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion within your trail organization and greater community. Can you speak to any specific realizations, considerations, or strategies for incorporating DEI into your urban trail project? And we'll start that with Beth. So you might want to add some thoughts to what you just spoke on, because it was very related.
Yeah, I think that designing or planning something within a community is really important, that you have stakeholders or community leaders that are a part of that outreach process, so that folks so you have more respect, right? If someone on your team is not necessarily from that community, but having advocates and community leaders as part of your outreach program is super important. I think we have made a lot of progress in the Charlotte region, also with people of color reaching out and talking about using bikes. That is something that's showing that you can use a bike and you can get around, and doing tours in our neighborhoods about the history of neighborhoods and the importance of that. The other thing that we do is we make sure, and I think probably all of the communities do this, that we make sure that we are breaking down community meetings to be something that's much more interesting than it ever was before. No one really wants to go into like a government building and sit there and listen to or look at maps. So we have a lot of our public meetings outside now and in communities, and actually do the bike tours and walk around and show what it would really look like, or do demonstration projects like another panelist was saying earlier. So being outside and going into the communities and making sure that you have their voice as part of the planning process.
Thanks, Beth. George?
Thanks. When we were developing the Chattahoochee Riverlands, and I would encourage people to just go to ChattahoocheeRiverlands.com to see the vision for themselves. We really targeted 4 communities. We basically looked and used demographic data to identify communities where we thought there might be displacement or gentrification, very high risk for gentrification, and then engage those communities in terms of having a conversation so they have some ownership of the solution. And I think that's very important. You've heard community in various ways throughout all the responses we've heard today. I think the first step is going to communities and listening, understanding their plight. And that really is the first step towards addressing DEI. A second thing we did actually is there's a young woman in Georgia, Amy Copeland, some people may have heard of her. She was in a zipline accident, got the flesh-eating bacteria, lost several limbs. And she was a key partner in terms of developing the Chattahoochee Riverlands and the design for the Chattahoochee Riverlands. Basically making sure when we talk about access, when we talk about inclusion, it's also folks with disability. And if you design to the point where an Amy Copeland or your 90-year-old grandfather or grandmother can use it, then you're making it accessible to all of us. And so I think that's a very important thing to do, is as you're going through this process, when you're thinking of inclusion, remember those with disabilities and engaging them early on and engaging them in the design. I think Aaron just kind of stressed that in a very, very thoughtful way.
Thanks, George. Aaron.
One example I just want to throw out there to help people even think more broadly about trails and connectivity, pedestrian bike connectivity. I did a plan for the Chamblee and Doraville communities of Atlanta, which is a significant immigrant and minority, real Asian community of Atlanta. And it's an area called Buford Highway, which has just the best, greatest, coolest restaurants and a real emerging foodie scene in Atlanta. And this community is mostly immigrants, don't like to engage in community processes. And even if they do, I think the question of, what is in this for us that was raised about other projects is what they ask. And so the cities wanted to extend a creek trail system that is being built in the area and extend it north into this area, going through the typical analysis of, well, how would that system extend? And we're able to, by making inroads with the immigrant community and having meetings with them, reaching out to them, going to them and having meetings, we ended up with this idea of creating a trail system out of the corridor and all the strip shopping centers that all of these businesses are in. All of this community, their restaurants and their businesses are all in these old aged strip shopping centers. And they were concerned that gentrification would come and displace all these businesses. But from a trail perspective, it didn't make sense how the trail would ever come through this area. But we ended up with this idea of using just the fronts of the shopping centers. They all have these continuous walkways and sidewalks in front of the businesses, and they're 1,000 feet, 1,200 feet of uninterrupted sidewalk connection. And the street frontage has curb cuts every 200 feet or 300 feet. So we're able to sort of see that, we can actually bring this trail to the front doors of these businesses. And then that turned into a way to celebrate the businesses. And then there was a public art aspect that came into it, engaging local artists, community artists. So that's now become something called the Buhai Walk. And so I just want listeners to really be able to feel more creative in thinking through their community and how a bike and ped system could be something that even transforms a suburban strip center type of environment. That there's an opportunity there.
Thanks, Aaron. And I think, I can't remember exactly, but I had a conversation with either Kathy or Becca about how they were using art along the trail for diversity engagement and to keep culture and historic neighborhoods extend the legacy. Would one of you want to talk about the use of art and the trails to do that?
Yeah, I'll chime in. Ours was relatively simple. I will say, when you asked this question, I thought of three things. It's meet people where they are, communicate in a way that they communicate. So for example, don't send a text survey out to a retirement home or something like that. If people don't have internet access, don't send a survey via email. And then my third thing would be follow through. And that's what I've learned the most. When you follow through and say you're going to put a curb cut in and that curb cut changes that neighborhood, you instantly have buy-in from that neighborhood, from those people for any project you're going to do, and they always remember. But yeah, I think one of the things I've learned from my time on trails is we love the idea of building trails, but that's not just what our organization is trying to do. We are trying to make sure that wherever we're putting trails, people feel ownership of those trails. Mm-hmm. And having conversations with people that are on our trails, we found out very quickly in South Columbus, it has been under-resourced. It's not had the representation that it should have for different projects. It hasn't seen economic development. But when you actually talk to the people that live there, what we found out is they really feel like their history especially the older generations, they feel like their history is being lost. And there's a lot of Black and brown civic leaders that came from these South Columbus neighborhoods that were trailblazers in our city and in our state and in our nation. And so talking with them, we found out that, you know, they really wanted to share this history, this rich history with the youth. And so along one of our trails, we partnered with an organization called Turnaround South Columbus. And we created very simple, very inexpensive, 11 different plaques that show they're on the trail, they're in front of these very famous community centers, schools, businesses that tell, you know, 2 or 3 paragraphs with beautiful pictures, really easy to understand the history of the Black and brown civic leaders from this area. And that has been one of the most successful art activations we've had along the trails. But one of the things I would say to anybody listening is, you know, you want to figure out a way for people on trails to connect with other people that they may not have come to the trail with. And one of the great ways to do that is through public art. You can sit, stare, linger, talk with somebody about a piece of art that or interact with that piece of art while somebody else is interacting with it. And that creates this instant connection. And so, you know, having public art, especially, I kind of said this before, but having public art in places that it's not easily accessible or there's a lack of it. In our downtown core, there is a ton of sculptures. There's most of our murals are in our uptown area, which is our downtown core. But in these other areas, for example, South Columbus, there's virtually no accessible public art. And so we started with these markers, and now we're doing murals and other things. And again, you know, the Beltline, I know we keep going back to it, but it's a great example of really having this robust art, public art program that has helped people, not only from an economic development perspective, but to connect with other people.
I love that. I also think the art makes it really family friendly. My kids always love seeing art on trail. That really heightens the experience for them. And then I'm the one, I can't pass a plaque up. Like I want to read the plaque. I'm a sucker for placards. So yeah, I always think those are nice additions. Any other thoughts from our other panelists before we move on?
I'll just add, I think Beth had brought this up earlier, but it is hard to get public input. And nobody wants to go into the government building. So we have had a lot of success about having our public meetings in parks and also along existing trails. And we've had a lot of people come out to those. And I think it was actually 2 years ago for North Point when we came up with that plan. We were so desperate to get people out there. We had a hot air balloon. And I'm telling you, we had a ton of people come out, tons of families. I mean, but it was so good because what good is a plan that we take to council to adopt if we do not get community input? So that's so important to us. And the things that you learn of existing, you know, walking paths that now you can draw and put into that plan, it's so important. And then I'll just add too, I think we've talked a little bit about this, but I think programming is good for the community on the trails to get the buy-in, but also establishing character areas. I mean, some areas, you know, in our historic downtown have different lighting, you know, different landscaping than if you go into outside of the historic district. So I think that's an important layer to also add to trails.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I also want to add a little bit to that too, just as far as our equity and inclusion efforts, specifically for the Beltline. You know, it really is about, you know, making changes to policy. And, you know, we went through a series of really deep, difficult conversations, and we actually started a lot of our equity and inclusion efforts internally and as an organization, and looked at our policies and procedures to see if they were perpetuating kind of the same outcomes that we've been getting for generations. And so, you know, we hired a consultant to come in, and it wasn't about, you know, individual, it was really about structures. And how do you change those structures to produce, more equitable outcomes. And so that really is, the changing piece when we're talking about equity and inclusion, is making sure your policies are beneficial to the entire community. And then also this piece about community input and engagement. Community engagement is the largest department at the Atlanta Beltline. Not design and construction, not economic development, but it's actually community engagement. We do not chew gum without going to the community and having a conversation. And what that means, though, is that sometimes those conversations are difficult, and you might not always agree, but you need to have that input. And so, we are charged with going to the community legislatively at least 4 times on a quarterly basis, 4 times a year. But we probably go to the community probably 30 plus times a year to have conversations about the various aspects about the Atlanta Beltline. But that piece is absolutely key.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Clyde. Thanks. Go ahead.
I think that's the activation part. I wanted to go back to that real quick. And there is an example about thinking about the rules and regulations that you have around your trails and how that sometimes prohibits the activation. So we have a Charlotte Rail Trail, which goes through an area in Charlotte. But one of the key things in that trail was to break down the barriers of people taking ownership of it. So you could go out there one morning and there'd be like art that just popped up, painted chairs that could be put there. And there was an active role to not move things around, not change it. If someone put up a billboard or put up a little placard on a light pole, you didn't take it down. So then it really became a community, and it is a community asset that people can change and be involved in and really take ownership from.
That's awesome. Thank you, Beth. Thank you all to all of our panelists. We are having a few questions come in, and one of the questions is, can the panelists ask questions for the rest of the panelists? Which the answer is yes. So if our panelists have questions for the rest of the group, you're welcome to put it in the Q&A box as well, or in the panelist chat, and we will also include that. Another question we have is, over the past 14 months, we have struggled globally with the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet during this time of social distancing and mask, we saw more engagement with outdoor health and wellness opportunities. What trends did you observe on your greenways and trails over the past 14 months? Do you think the pandemic helped people to realize the significance of the physical, mental, and emotional benefits of urban trails? And on that note, are you looking into any funding through the Recovery Act or other similar resources that have developed as a result of the pandemic? To start, Becca, why don't you kick us off?
I think one of the bright points of going through a global pandemic was a realignment of people's mental health and their physical health. And the amount of people we saw on the trail increased exponentially, and our data backs that up. It's not just a visual. And I think it was, so many people were working from homes, and so many of our neighborhoods are connected to our trail systems, that we saw the trails being used maybe more for mental health breaks than anything else. I mean, you could walk the Riverwalk or the Fall Line Trace, our 2 major trails next to neighborhoods, and see people just, taking a conference call while walking, or, sometimes we'd have conversations and say, do you normally come out here, or why are you out here? And they would say, taking 10-minute break from, 10 back-to-back Zooms or something like that. So I think like one of the bright points of the pandemic has been absolutely people have started using the trails more than they ever have. And people, you've seen with bicycle shops that their sales have soared, and there's issues with sourcing. But I think that's okay, and that's a good thing, because we're seeing that even though the numbers aren't exactly the same as they were in March or April or May of last year, they're still much higher than they were in 2018 and 2017.
Great. Other thoughts on the impact of the pandemic as in results of trends and/or funding for your projects?
I will add real quick, I've seen a change in the mixed use developments that are being submitted, especially with the residential that include a heavy amount of residential. They're including outdoor workspaces. So they'll have the trail system, and now they've included the outdoor workspaces to make sure that the residents that may work from home, part of the time in the future have a place to work. And I would also say that during the pandemic, we were actually working on our comprehensive land use plan. So we had sent out a survey of what's the number one reason to choose where you live. And they said connectivity. That was the number one. It's usually schools, safety, other reason, job, but it was connectivity and trails. And they also said that that should be government's main role is to help provide that connectivity. So that was interesting. That was the first time we've seen something like that.
And I would just share just real quick, as we think about some of our efforts through the pandemic, one of the things that I like to remind people of, and George knows this story well, but perhaps this time last year, the Beltline team, we were in the posture of asking people not to get on the Beltline unless you were using it in a functional way. So meaning that you were using it to walk to work, walk to grocery store, walk to a doctor's office. And so there was one point during the early throes of the pandemic that we depressed our user numbers over 50%. And that was significant. So you got to think about the Beltline that enjoys, over 2 million visitors, on our trails a year. And so we were in that posture of telling people to only use it for point A and not to congregate, because you got to remember during this time, the science hadn't caught up, with the populist thinking at that point. So there was a loud minority of people at the time in Atlanta that were really asking, like, Clyde, shouldn't you close the Beltline, during this? Because again, the science hadn't caught up. People, didn't understand, spray theory and things of that nature. And so people were nervous at that point. But one of the things that we had to do is really rest on the science and the leadership that we got from a lot of the public health experts out there, which really suggested that, like, hey, they told the mayor, they told me, like, you should have the Beltline open for a place for people to get out and get fresh air. And so we stuck to our guns. And of course, we're here today, and most people are, of course, the Beltline should be open. But I would tell you, this time last year, I was taking interviews from the media. Clyde, the Beltline's open, and we see people walking there, and they're walking places. Is that good? And so I just want to remind people, we're here today, but 12 months ago, that wasn't necessarily the mindset. We were getting challenged, if you will. So a vocal minority, but people were still challenging that thought.
Yeah, if I can jump in there, Clyde, the national government closed the national parks. And just to kind of reinforce what Clyde was saying, there was so much fear out there. And the Trust Fund Land, I remember just nationally, people still went. they may have thought they closed those parks, but there were no rangers there, but there were plenty of people there. So we actually were advocating for the federal government to open up the parks and to start cleaning them. And you asked actually about the impact on funding. And I will say, we're nonprofit. We funding from foundations and others. And during the summer of last year, everything was 100% COVID. I mean, we were in crisis. People not know what was going on. But we'd have conversations with funders, and they would say, George, right now, no. We're worried about schools, worried about food, worried about what basics. But when we come out of this, you are not going to have to make your case again about the importance of parks and trails, because everybody gets it. And so I think that we did kind of shift from one state of being to another through this pandemic. And my hope is, I mean, Becca was talking about how you're still seeing that increased usage. I think Clyde's probably seeing the same thing, that the pandemic has re-emphasized, it's reconnected us to nature. And I think that we will see increased public funding and private funding in trails and public spaces because of that.
Thanks, George.
Oh, let me need to do a plug actually. There's a federal Parks, Jobs, and Equity Act actually that as part of this economic recovery from COVID is trying to get additional federal funding, $500 million in parks and trails. And so just encourage you guys to take a look at that. Ask your representative to support it. It's a big policy initiative for the Trust for Public Land.
Any other thoughts from our panelists?
I have one.
Okay, thanks, Beth.
So COVID, going back to the COVID, I think one of the things that I really noticed in thinking about how COVID has affected trails, it changed the way I think about it actually, is I love like a destination trail. The Atlanta Beltline's awesome. Little Sugar Creek Greenway Crossroad Trail, all of those are great. But it really brought to my attention how important it is to have close trails to everyone so that you can get to those and so that everyone has access to get right out. So thinking about our sidewalks and our streets and how important it is to think about those as really being safely accommodating, you know, the 8 to 80 crowd on a bike or walking, which we don't have, right? It's so hard to have that everywhere, and really focusing now, I think if I were in charge of city government funding, is really making sure that the neighborhoods have good infrastructure and access for walking and biking right outside people's doors.
And the research too is supporting that if people walk on a path that is surrounded by some type of nature feature, trees or a river, it lowers their stress and anxiety far more than if they were walking on a sidewalk. And when stress and anxiety goes up, like we saw last year, having those resources become really significant to community health. So those are all good thoughts. I'm going to pull in an audience question real quick. For our panelists, if you have to choose one of the best trails or maybe a model of an urban trail that you have ever seen, which one comes to mind in the US or around the world, and what makes you think it's so great? Anyone want to start us with that? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Of course, Beltline's number one by far. And you know, that's a real urban trail. Of course, with our trail, it's more urban than our greenway, but if you're talking about an urban city. And I think the High Line is a great trail. I think it's so interesting. I love the contemporary design and how they made it interesting when it's an elevated between buildings, but they were still able to put in sustainable landscaping. I think it's really well done.
Thanks, Kathy. George?
Well, I was going to say the Beltline too. I was almost a little too shy to respond in that regard. And the Highline does come to mind. The 606 in Chicago is another good one that I'd lift up as a really great example.
Clyde, are you blushing? Okay, Clyde, you can't pick yourself. So what trail do you look at as a model?
Okay, so outside of the Beltline, so just make sure people let me give that context. And you know, it's kind of hard to brag on your own project, but I do appreciate those nice comments. And but I'm kind of in the place where George is. I think the 606 is well done. The High Line, you know, I've been to the High Line on a number of occasions. We have a couple of things in common with the High Line in that if you think about Ponce City Market off the Beltline, the East Side Trail, the High Line has something comparable and by the same developer, by the way, called Chelsea Market. And so it is a great example of adaptive reuse right off of the Beltline, which is called Ponce City Market. And the case with the High Line, it's Chelsea Market, and it's just thriving. The Buffalo Bayou in Houston, and also the Underline in Miami Those are just, and again, this is kind of what I do in my free time, is just go visit trails across the country. But I could have a whole hour conversation with you about the number of great projects that we have in the metro area and in other states.
And I think the Ponce Market is part of our background. Is that correct, that you just referenced?
That is correct. So what you see literally right
I know.
here is
Other side. We're there, right there. Any other models of urban trails that you all would like to mention?
I really enjoyed Philadelphia's trail system and how it connected to so many different parks and their waterways. I was really impressed by the work that they had done.
So speaking of Philadelphia and their trail system, which I believe goes all the way out to Valley Forge, another one of our questions is, what role does landscape conservation and historic preservation play in the planning design of urban trails? And anyone is free to kick us off at this point.
I mean, I would add that, I'm always, whenever I'm doing planning work in a community, and if there's a trail element as well, I'm always asking this question: how does this community keep up, and how does it stand out? Because a community that's not keeping up with the competition, everyone has a choice of where to go. No one has to stay in a community. People can be mobile, people can pick up and leave, businesses can leave, people can leave. So I'm always trying to figure out, how does this community keep up? And more trails are going to be the thing that you keep up, because your competition has them. Either they're next door or they're a state away, but that's all your competition. But how do you stand out? And to me, that's the fun part of this work, is thinking through how you create, whether in a trail system plan, how can it embrace the community it's going through? How can it reflect the culture, the character, the history, the people, the stories of that place? And so that can be, if there's a historic preservation opportunity, embrace it. Because otherwise this trail can feel somewhat monotonous, or it can even feel like the other trail in the other city next door. And really, at the end of the day, we've got to create places that stand out, because that's going to be your strength. And so, yeah, I think you have to just look for those opportunities. And if you have a historic preservation component, embrace it, make sure the trail is integrated into that kind of a place, and let the historic preservation influence that segment of the trail. I think those are always exciting opportunities to stand out.
I agree. I think trails tell stories, and that's really significant. George?
I was going to borrow Clyde's gumbo analogy here. And that's really what you're talking about, is you're just adding all these different elements to the trail. And yeah, you need to have that sense of space. You need to have the sense of community, and the landscape and the historic preservation reflects that. So it's not about just a concrete, 10, 12 foot wide trail. It's about the entirety of your experience.
Y'all are making me hungry. Didn't do dinner before the panel. Now I'm craving gumbo.
Jennifer, I want to add one thing just real quick on the tail end of that. So many of our public spaces they're public, but they're not for you, right? Like when you're on the street, there's rules to the street. There's speed limits, there's cars, there's engineers who tell us how wide the lanes need to be, and there's safety, and think about the realm of public spaces that we interact with. Even oftentimes our parks are not really for us. It might be for if you're playing a baseball game, or maybe if you're there for a concert. But I just think through, for community members to be in a public space and to be able to say, this place is mine, it's for me, it represents me. I might even see something I did that is a part of this place, and some ideas were mentioned around that. And I think these trails are oftentimes those places where you can do that. We don't have to have the engineers designing the place to keep it, where we can't do this or can't do that, or it's heavily programmed, and so we can't do this or you can't do that. So I just think that these trails really, we need to take every opportunity, whether it's historic preservation or if it's telling the story of this neighborhood, to let these places be sacred places for the community to say, this is us. I see me there. I got to be a part of making this in some cases. And it's one of the few public places where that can happen.
That's a really good point. Someone asked a question that maybe just one of our panelists knows the answer to and can let us know where to go for this resource. But someone was wondering, is there a national organization or agency that is an unbiased repository of metrics such as property appreciation, rent escalation, sales receipts, and similar data as these trails mature? Is there a governing national body of urban trails that has this type of data?
Well, I don't know specifically if this group here collects those items, but I will tell you that there's a group that was formed by the High Line. So that this network, if you will, is a collection of rails to trails projects, just across the country, and they come together on a regular basis, and the Beltline is kind of a leading member for that network, and so they share best practices, data, and so that's a good organization, and I know they capture a lot of information out there, so I do want to give them a shout out for some of the work that they do.
Cool. Okay, so we'll check them out. Any other resources that anyone wants to mention?
I'll jump in. The trust fund, the trust fund land is a lot of national economic impact analyses. I'm sure a lot of folks do too. We are a nonprofit, so a lot of that is public. If you go to our website, it's not all amalgamated into one group, but you can get a lot of information about the economic impact of trails and public spaces at tpl.org.
Great. Thanks, George. I want to ask a question because the second part of the symposium is focused on developers and builders. As trail leaders, what advice would you give to builders and developers as they look to partner with and incorporate urban trails into their projects? Maybe we can start with Aaron on this one.
I think the old way of thinking about trails, even from a development perspective, is that it's just transportation. And I think the Beltline is a good example. The High Line is a good example of how trails can really be more integrated into development and facilitate economic development and be of value to the development. There are still trail systems where there's a path and then there's a fence on both sides, and then there's on and off points, and that's really the system. And I think that's very utilitarian, and that is a way to move people from point A to point B, but you don't really get the lift and the economic impact of that. I really love how on the Beltline, the East Side Trail, the Ponce City Market, and now there's a Kroger redevelopment on the other side. Those developments are treating the Beltline as they're actively engaging the Beltline, and it's creating a true place on the inside on the trail. It's not just about movement, although you still have to have movement and you can't slow down that movement. But it's really leveraged that trail as almost like a street. And that's really the ultimate way to catalyze development, by engaging it that way. So I would just encourage everyone listening to continue to think through, again, I think that's a design detail of how development and what I would hope developers would think through is how to think through, I don't want to just be positioned on a trail or be positioned next to a trail. I'd actually like to find opportunities to engage that trail, and when you do that engagement, it really lifts the entire development.
Other thoughts for developers looking to partner with trail partners?
I think I would agree with what Aaron's saying. It's almost like they have two front doors, and when they lay out their plan, they really need to think about that and it's, I think that the residents have so much buy-in now to the trails and they love the trails. So now they are asking the questions, what should the height be from the trail? We have height regulations from the street, but now it's looking at architecture from the trail, landscaping, height, distance to the trail. So I think that's something that we will, anybody that's building trails is going to be looking at in the future.
Thanks, Kathy. Any other panelists want to speak directly towards the developers or builders? We have probably more questions here than we're going to get to. Some of them ask about safety. Some of them ask about how trails not only attract development, but also land preservation and conservation. We talk about design. There's questions about design. So what I'd really like to do, because we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to give each panelist about 2 minutes roughly to share with us tonight your closing thoughts, maybe on one of those topics, if you want to speak directly into that. But then also, the whole idea of this symposium and this panel is to talk about the future of urban trails, the future of urban trails and development. So I'd like to hear your hopes and dreams for the futures of urban trails as you leave us with your parting thoughts tonight on any other topic that we didn't get a chance to cover. So if we could start with Beth.
I'm sure. I want to share back one more thing, though. It's when the question about what's your favorite trail, and I, this is going to sound like, oh, not really. You shouldn't say that, which is the Netherlands. I think that that was really influenced me into becoming a designer and a planner about ped bike infrastructure, was living there and experiencing that. And again, it was sort of the network, like creating a network is so important. So having destinations, having your trail go somewhere. So I would say that to the thing I would like to leave on is connecting to destinations. So when the developers get on, my question to them is this, is what is it that a municipality or a city can do to entice you to build a high quality trail that they envision? And what are some of the hurdles for you doing that? And I explain that because I know that working with a lot of municipalities, we do come up with really great visions, really good materials, really good design. And then when it comes down to the developer having to develop that, there's a lot of pushback about the cost or the maintenance. And so I'd like to hear from the developer side, what are some of the hurdles and what are some of their suggestions back to municipalities or trail builders and how that we can work together better. And yeah, I'll end on that.
Those are good questions, and hopefully they will be able to answer them in the next segment. Erin, would you like to go next with any closing thoughts? Oh, Erin, you're on mute.
All right, sorry. I just would end with elaborating on, I saw the question on, asking for any more elaboration on what good design is. I think good design for trails is that the trail is engaged by the things that are next to it. Now, that doesn't mean that there's everyone next to the trail has their own walkway onto the trail. There's a way to visually engage a trail so that there's eyes on the trail. If you've heard this term, eyes on a street, that makes the street safer. And I think the uses along a trail, you're going to have to limit the actual access points on a trail. That makes sense. But to engage it means that there's a presence on the trail by the uses that are next to it, that it can frame the trail from a design perspective in a enclosure and a sense of place while you're on the trail, but also giving people and the uses next to it, whether it's the offices or the restaurants and the retail or the residential, a real view to the trail so they can participate and be a part of that place. And it makes it feel safer. It makes it feel like it's more invested in. So I think that engagement is just a great, to me, a lesson learned on good design. And then the last thing I would design is just, as I'd said before, taking the opportunity in trail planning to let the neighborhood that trail is going through, let that neighborhood take the design of that trail, and in small ways and sometimes big ways. It could be signage that changes based on the theme of the neighborhood. It could be the art that changes, that reflects the character of the neighborhood, or telling the stories of the people and the places and the history of those neighborhoods. So all those I would just add as a few more little nuanced ideas for good design on trails.
One of my favorite features is always just, it's so simple, but when there's the little tags for trees or plants, especially if they're native, that always, I love that. I love learning about native plants along trails. Aaron, do you have any hopes or dreams for the futures of urban trails?
I do. I think in more urban, dense places. I also think of the Netherlands, and got to study in Amsterdam and urban design in Amsterdam. And I think where we're heading is a place like in the Netherlands and like Amsterdam, where there will become streets that really are just carless. That's really, I think, where we're going. And we won't, in more mature urban environments, we won't think about it anymore as like, oh, there's a trail, let me go to the trail. We'll think about that there are pedestrian and bike streets, and they will be more widespread and more accessible. I think that's where we're going. I think that would be great. And then in small towns, I think the future is to have trail systems. That really is the next 20 years of hard work of small towns and small cities actually just building the capacity and the political will to just create these systems that they won't take over and be widespread and everywhere in the town, but they'll at least create the mechanism. I think that's the next 20 years for big cities and small cities.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. Becca, would you like to add your closing thoughts and any hopes and dreams for urban trails?
Yeah, I'll kind of answer that second question. I think from Columbus's perspective, because we are on the Chattahoochee River, I think there's an incredible, and we share the Chattahoochee River with Phoenix City, Alabama, and 2 counties over there. I think there's a really incredible opportunity to create a regional trail in our area that connects to the south of us is Fort Benning, which is a major Army installation with hundreds of miles of trails. And so how do we connect to our neighbors on the west and the south, but then also with the Chattahoochee Riverlands project, as George mentioned, we have a rail bed that goes from, we're in Muskogee County, it goes all the way to Muskogee County. There's some empty rail beds in Harris County, and then you just got to get to Meriwether to get to the Riverlands project. So I think one of my great aspirations is, how do we connect almost the entire state of Georgia along the Chattahoochee River? And the Riverlands project is incredible, but we got to get Columbus and some of the other cities in the southern side of the state connected as well. So those are sort of my hopes and dreams. And I'm just so appreciative to be on this panel today. And I've learned a lot, and looking forward to hearing from the economic developers.
Thanks, Becca. And since you mentioned the river project, I feel like we should go to George next. George, what do you want to leave us with this evening?
Okay, so it's interesting talking about the Riverlands. I often talk about, if you could imagine flying into Atlanta, taking MARTA to the Atlanta Beltline, taking the Beltline to either the Proctor Creek Trail or the Silver Comet Trail, and then up to the Chattahoochee River. You get up to the Chattahoochee Riverlands and just follow the Chattahoochee all the way up past Beaufort Dam. And this is like, the big vision from Helena Columbus. And the spring waters for the Chattahoochee River are about 100 yards from the Appalachian Trail. Actually, Greg Winchester and I had been up there together. And so you just keep on going. You hop on the Appalachian Trail and suddenly you're in Maine. So let's connect from Columbus all the way up to Maine. So maybe you can fly in and do that. And just kind of that big visionary. I think we need to dream big like that. And the Beltline was a big dream, and the Riverlands are a big dream. We often say we want to be to Metro Atlanta what the Beltline is to Atlanta. And then I want to leave with just a little bit of a plug, if I may. One of the other things that the Trust Park Land does here in Georgia is we've helped form this Georgia Outdoor Recreation Coalition. And we are advocating for various things, and one of which is a statewide trails master plan. We are going to have a conference in Augusta, the 7th and 8th of November in person. we'll have a big emphasis on being outdoors and experiencing the trails and other outdoor recreation amenities there. So just invite you guys all to join us for the Georgia Outdoor Recreation and Trail Summit. If you go to gaoutdoors.org, you can get some more information about it. So apologies for putting my plug in there. We're nonprofit. We have to take opportunities when we can find them.
No, that's great. And I love what you said about your vision of urban trails connecting with more rural or remote or mountainous trails. And Georgia and the Southeast already has an extensive backcountry trail system that includes the Pinhoti Trail in Alabama and Georgia, the Benton MacKaye Trail in North Carolina and Georgia, of course, the Appalachian Trail, the Palmetto Trail in South Carolina, the Mount Sissy Trail in North Carolina. So there are all these trails that are being created now, both urban and elsewhere, and to ultimately connect them all and give people access in the city to large preserved tracts of wilderness or forest or land is something that would be wonderful to see. So I love that vision.
If I may just, I'm sorry for grabbing all the time, but the Beltline is kind of this hub for all these trails in Atlanta. Yeah. And the Chattahoochee Riverlands is kind of a spine in which we all connect. But similarly, the Appalachian Trail or the East Coast Greenway Trail could be that spine where we all kind of connect and work our way up and down the East Coast. So I like that vision too.
Just have to stretch a little farther. Kathy or Clyde. Clyde, would you like to share your closing thoughts with us today and your hopes and dreams for urban trails of the future?
Well, I just want to say thank you again for having me on this panel. It was just enriching. And then I really do appreciate all of the great, wonderful comments and everybody doting on the Beltline. It really is energizing. So thank you truly for that. And for me, it really is. And I'm an innovation guy. And so now that we have put the capital stack to complete, the full 22-mile loop within the city of Atlanta Beltline project, excited. But what kind of keeps me up is future proofing the Beltline. There's just something in me that I don't want to miss the what's next, that I can't even imagine 10 years from now that's going to be really important to us from a connectivity and community needs perspective. And so one of the things that we have pushed through is, a lot of people don't know this, but we actually have conduit literally underneath the Beltline. And so we're in the process of installing dark fiber. And so we'll be able to have, smart opportunities and it's things that I can't even imagine right now that we'll be able to flip a switch and have available from a security perspective. I can imagine a world where we flip something on and we just give free Wi-Fi to schools that are adjacent or in the Beltline catchment area. But that innovation piece right there, keeps me up at night to think about, like, wow, what is it? What is it? And that energizes me. That energizes me as well. So just trying to be futuristic and not just thinking about what's in front of us today.
Well, Clyde, it sounds like you have a lot of good things to keep you up at night. So I hope you get some rest too. I hope you get some sleep for all that good work you're doing in Atlanta. And then we'll close out with Kathy this evening, sharing some of her thoughts and hopes and dreams.
A couple of things I'll add to that. I hope that, cities continue to buy parkland along the trails. I think there's been a big shift to buy smaller pieces along the trail where you can put history centers, outdoor workspace, and even outdoor classroom space. So I think that as we continue to develop our trails, that's going to be important. And I'll give a little bit of advice to trail builders. I think it's important to, where you need to work with the trees and the topography, build the elevated sections. And if you have to wait, it's going to be more expensive. But I think it's so important to have those sections of your trail where it matters. And, you know, you're going to have a lot of pieces that are built on grade, but you need those pieces of that kind of, you know, meander through the tree. So I think that's an important part. And then lastly, I think it's important for economic development that when you have your plans, go to the leasing agents, the property owners, make sure they know. They're the ones that are selling your city. So if you don't teach them your future plans, then they don't know. And I think that's how I'll end it.
Awesome. Those are wonderful parting words and some advice for us. And I want to thank all our trail leaders tonight for being a part of the panel. This has been a really just excellent, informative, thought-provoking conversation. And I hope this helps connect you all, and that our developers and builders are also now more aware of the projects you have going on. Thank you to our audience who also contributed their questions. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Kim Curtin. Kim is the Executive Director of Graduate Executive Programs in the Harvard College of Business and the Administrative Director of the MRED program. Kim, here you go.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to add my welcome to all the participants who's joining us tonight, and my appreciation to the panelists who are taking time to visit with us and share their wisdom and experience. I'd like to spotlight our premier sponsors for this event: Raymond James, TerraCap, Trimont Real Estate Advisors, and Synovus. We're now going to take a brief intermission until 7 o'clock Central Time, at which time we'll host our developers panel.
Good evening. Welcome back, everyone, to the future of urban trails and real estate development. We just finished up 15 minutes ago with our urban trail leaders panel, and I think they kind of threw down the gauntlet to this panel that's coming up now. It's the developers panel and real estate professionals. So I have the good fortune tonight to moderate this panel of distinguished property professionals who have done projects along urban trails in the United States. So to kick this off, I'm going to call out your name, and then if you could unmute yourself and just share a little bit about, introduce yourself and share a little bit about your company, that would be great. So I'll start off with Mr. Warren Jolly.
Thanks, Greg. My name is Warren Jolly. I'm president of the Providence Group. We're a residential builder in Atlanta, Georgia. We build a lot of urban areas in some of the city Atlanta and some of these cities that we'll be talking about tonight. A lot of townhomes, a lot of condos. We don't do anything but for sale. And we don't normally the move up buyer demographics are permanent to our buyer, but and we're part of a publicly traded company, and so that allows us to do pretty sizable projects in Atlanta. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, and it's great to be here tonight. I'm with Boatwright. I'm a partner with Boatwright, one of the founding partners, and we are a Charlotte-based developer who some projects in Charlotte, Asheville, and Greenville primarily. And we focus on primarily urban infill projects, residential in nature for the most part. We do lot development for home builders, and we do apartment development, and we do adaptive reuse of office. And it's good to be here.
Thank you, Chris. Lyle.
Hey, thanks, Greg. Hey, guys. Most of the audience may have already heard from me because I was talking about 5 minutes ago with Richard, but sorry about that. But Lyle Darnell, I'm with Edens. We are a retail landlord that owns 110 plus shopping centers up and down the East Coast, private REIT. we've been fortunate to develop some stuff along a few trail areas here. So I'm excited to be a big part of this panel.
Thank you. Welcome, Lyle. Pace?
Good evening. Thank you. I'm Pace Halter, the President and Chief Operating Officer at W.C. Bradley Real Estate in Columbus. Much like the others, we're in the development business. Obviously, we own and manage about 2 million square feet, mostly in the Columbus market. As of February 1st, in every asset class. We opened a brand new hotel February 1st in downtown Columbus. But we do a little bit of everything from construction to development to land acquisition. Again, mostly in Columbus, but we are starting to move outside of Columbus around the Southeast. So glad to be here tonight.
Glad you're with us, Pace. Richard?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Richard Petersheim. I am a partner with the firm Land Design, based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. We've got offices across the U.S. and work globally on projects. I focus predominantly within the Southeast region. I come to this conversation knowing a handful of you, Chris and Lyle, I've worked with on several things. We also are working from two different angles on that. You heard from my partner, Beth, on the public side, which I'm somewhat involved in, and then I convert to the private side and help see these places be implemented. So I really look forward to kind of looking at a balanced approach to this tonight and having a good conversation.
Thank you. Welcome, Richard. Okay, so we're going to jump into some of the specific questions now, and I'll go ahead and maybe on this next one, just call out your names. We heard a lot of different trail names and locations with the urban trail leaders. LaGrange, Georgia, Opelika, Charlotte, Asheville, Greenville, Atlanta, and a few other places in between, including jumping up to New York. So Warren, can you share with the group a project or two that your firm has done along an urban trail?
Yes, so we've, being from Atlanta, we have actually one active project on the Beltline right now in Grant Park. And we've done another one in Grant Park that's finished on the Beltline. We've also have completed two projects in Alpharetta that are on their pathway system, the Alpha Loop. And then we have 3 current projects going on the Alpha Loop currently. We've also have a project right now on the, I didn't hear about the Stone Mountain Trail, but there's a trail that runs from Avondale to downtown Decatur. We have a project currently on that trail. And then we've got 2 past projects that we did on the Big Creek Trailway system in Fulton County. And that's currently what we've got going on now.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, sure. As I looked at the 12 or 13 deals we've done since we've been around for 8 years, about half of them are on trails or within a block of trails here in Charlotte and different trails. But there's one in particular that we started in December that is a 2-phase townhome development that's right on a trail, the Stewart Creek Greenway Trail, that leads to Uptown. And so it's about two miles from Uptown on the trail. And we're actually, the home builder that's building that one, it's going to call it Greenway Townhomes. And they are marketing to the Greenway and catering to that. And so that's been the most recent one. We also have another project on the other end of that trail that we're working with Richard on, called the Foundry, that connects that trail with Uptown. And that's actually where our office sits, and is a pretty exciting part of the urban trail over there.
Great.
Thank you.
So Lyle?
Yeah, we've got projects that I've been involved with, just with Edens, and both really kind of reside right there in Charlotte. We were fortunate enough to purchase one of the oldest open air shopping centers in Charlotte, called Park Road Shopping Center. It's got about 450,000 square feet of retail on what originally was Billy Graham's childhood farm that he grew up on. And it backs up to a creek system called the Sugar Creek. It's one of the earlier trails. I think Beth may have even talked about it earlier, called the Sugar Creek Greenway. So that's one. And then we just wrapped up a development called Atherton Mill that Richard was and his group were really kind of instrumental on. That it was right there on the Charlotte Light Rail Trail system. So we've got two projects. One is a little bit more involved with the trail, Atherton is, than Park Road. However, both of them are immediately adjacent to it.
Thank you. Pace?
Absolutely. Actually, most of our holdings are along the Columbus Trail system, and I won't rehash what I'm sure Becca Zajac shared in detail with you. But the majority of our holdings, we own a 4-block stretch along the Chattahoochee River in downtown Columbus, which all front on the Columbus Riverwalk. So most of our downtown assets are on that Riverwalk. Interestingly enough, we own a film and television studio in northeast Columbus that ironically sits at the far end of our Dragonfly Trail system that connects to that Riverwalk. So with the exception of a couple of office assets in North Columbus, everything we own sits and have developed sits along one of our trail systems in Columbus.
Mm-hmm. Great. Richard?
So I would think the one that I've been involved in the longest, it's not, I mean, I guess from a planning perspective, back in '98, we were instrumental in the south end of Charlotte, the vintage trolley line, which eventually became our blue line, our first light rail line to Pineville. And as part of the regional planning, the Charlotte Rail Trail emerged as a pretty significant idea early on that set the stage for Lyle's project at Atherton Mill and a host of others. We pretty much have looked at about a dozen TODs along that plug into directly to that trail. And it's been amazing to just see from an idea, 30 years ago about this asset that can stitch communities back together. It really went through two pretty challenged, or one challenged community, to really stitch the community together and create economic development, as well as a place that is from an experiential standpoint. And what Lyle's done with orchestrating the retail around it has just been an exceptional series of planning to development projects. So that's probably one that'll keep me busy for many years past those two. It's been pretty active.
Yeah, it's we heard a lot from the urban trail leaders about building communities, and I love your phrase, stitch communities back together. It's a great way to embrace that and share that. Okay, so thank you. Now, we heard this from the other group, what are some of the opportunities that you see as a real estate professional for your developments being, next to an urban trail? What, from the upside standpoint, or just the benefits, what do you really think are some of the opportunities? So Warren, we'll start again with you.
I think the upside's terrific. Some of the complexities in the for sale component is exactly on the Alpha Loop and some of the others. They're not completely finished or built by the time we get finished and built. Example, the Beltline, our project on the Beltline, in Grant Park is not complete. So we've not really benefited 100% from an active trail system really being totally complete. It's sections of it. But even having sections of it built, people do understand the connectivity, and we are selling our properties. We don't lease anything. So disclosure it's very important that they know what's coming and how it's going to be complete and how they're going to connect, so they don't come back and say, well, I didn't know this was going to be done this way or that. So so that's a big component when you're selling it. So I think, but we've seen terrific value. I mean, I think we are a kind of move up and a lifestyle builder. So it fits our lifestyle, having the connectivity, especially in the Beltline or even the Alpha Loop, all the retail, the restaurants that you can walk to. You can go up there and any night is covered up with people walking on it. So it's tremendous upside. It would be better probably long-term if we could see the longer benefits if we had bigger projects, because our projects are so small, we're almost done, before it gets finished. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, it seems like over the last, since I've been back in Charlotte, the last 8 years, the energy around urban trails has really improved. There's, at first there were people exercising and using it to get out and walk. Now there's people commuting and opening up breweries and restaurants and all kinds of activation points. I mean, the project that Lyle has at Atherton Mill is a perfect example where there's just so much energy around his project right on the trail. And it's a good example of how it can be a real amenity to any project, frankly, the more and more it's used. So I see the real opportunity in trails is for developers is as they're used more and more, shifting the front door to the trails and really benefiting from the activity.
Yeah, I think we heard from some of the urban trail leaders about requesting that developers think of the trails as the front door or second door. Lyle?
Well, thank you, Chris and Richard. I must owe Richard some money because that was a very nice compliment there. And I don't think I owe you any money, Chris, but I appreciate
Square,
that
man. I think
too. But it's I think that specifically with Atherton, if you hadn't seen it, it sits right there on the light rail, and we made a conscientious decision to actually run the trail through the development. So when I say through the development, we saved a very specific building, which was a trolley barn where they used to work on trolley cars, and we ran the light rail trail between the trolley barn and the dollar development deal that we did. And when you really kind of sit there and look at it, and this answer will be longer than I think it should be, but I want to kind of go through the numbers just a bit. But so the actual light rail itself, there's CATS that kind of the Charlotte Area Transit System runs along there, which has about 26,000 riders a day. And the project itself fronts on South Boulevard, which has about 30,000 cars per day. So basically, I'm doubling. If you orient the project towards South Boulevard as well as towards the trail and the light rail, then you're doubling your exposure. And to give you another example is that if a shopping center does $80 million a year in business, based on a $45 average basket, you're generating about 5,500 trips per day. And that's just people coming into the shopping center, 5,500 people buying $45 worth of goods and leaving. So the light rail itself has got approximately 3,000 people a day that are on the light rail trail. Now they're not all going through Atherton and whatever, but when you're exposed to that many people per day, whether it be through exercise or general walks or whatever, we immediately knew that there weren't a lot of gathering spots up and down the light rail trail system. So with Richard's team's help and whatever, we decided to kind of create a really solid amenity area for people to kind of hang out and pause and do and whatever. So let's take this a little bit further. So if you've got about 3,000 people a day on the trail, and basically you get about 20%, 18% of that population actually stops and shops. So then basically you're going to get about 550 people that shop, and you're going to spend $50 a day. That's another $25,000 a day in retail sales that are hanging out in your shopping center. So there's another real interesting fact that it's actually proven that if you can get your customer to stay at your shopping center 10% longer, then your shopping center sales actually increased by 13%. So it's not a dollar for dollar. It's like $1.30 for $1. So if in addition to that, because you got a nice little place for people to hang out, you get people to extend their stay by 20% of their time, then in essence, I am increasing their sales by another $75,000 a day. So you can take a retail center that initially was doing $250,000 a day, you capture some of the traffic on the trail that shops, and you extend their stay by 20%, then in essence, you are increasing the overall retail sales for that shopping center by $100,000 a day, or basically a third. So it'd be foolish for us as a retail landlord not to try to pander to and be attractive to the customer that is up and down that trail, because that's real dollars and cents to the retailers, and that ultimately means success for the overall retail shopping center. So that's the math behind how it works, and that's really what drove us to wherever in the world we can, we'll try to connect to any kind of trail and be up adjacent to it. It's phenomenal what it can do for you.
That's really fascinating. And just to kind of put it in a little more perspective, can you share kind of the size and scope and mix of your project there?
Yeah, we've got there's two specific buildings. There's a historic building that's about 50,000 square feet that you can't touch, that we've kind of converted. And then we have retailers in that historic building that Free People, Anthropology, there's a number of restaurants and whatever. And then the new project itself was $100 million redevelopment, where we tore down some old non-historic buildings and added another 65,000 square feet of retail, as well as approximately 350 apartment buildings. Now, Crescent was our partner in the apartment project. We just do strictly retail. And so you got a retail shopping center that's West Elm, Bonobos, Lululemon, Madewell, and a number of locals as well. So that's basically the project itself.
So you've really got a significant mixed-use urban project right oriented on the trail.
We do. And this historic South End, where Chris is doing a lot of work and stuff, it's blowing up with apartments as well as townhomes, and it is the place to go to when you're in Charlotte. And one of the things that we figured out is that there's not a central shopping area for all of the people that are moving into South End. And Atherton itself was blessed with a really, really good location. And if we treated the project right, with a certain mix of parking and trail access and everything else in the right tenant mix, that it could ultimately become, which is the goal for any of our shopping centers, is ultimately become the central gathering spot for all of South End.
So that's back to the community aspect.
It's got to be ultimately helping build the communities around it and create a central gathering spot. And then the rest of it takes care of itself.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Pace, obviously your firm is extremely well-versed in this area. So you must have discovered a lot of opportunities. So please share.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's not too dissimilar from kind of Lyle's description, I guess, without the analytics, which is the majority of what we do is really focused on the experience. And what is that experience like, whether that be for a resident in an apartment, a guest at the hotel, or even a tenant in an office building. And the connectivity, whether it be through parks or trails or both, helps drive that piece of the overall experience that includes whatever the amenities may be in the project, et cetera. And I think that for us is really where we have found residual, almost unexpected value. Is it's hard to pencil sometimes, although it sounds like Lyle's done a really good job of it. But in finding out and figuring out that if we place assets of whatever type along trails and or parks and make it an integral part of that overall experience, we found significant upside in value in rent as well as on the for sale side in trying to co-locate those amenities, if you will.
Mhm.
But again, it's all driven by what that overall experience is.
Experience, got it. So Richard, you've seen a lot of different things. What are some of the major opportunities you've noticed?
Well, I think, and it's been mentioned a couple times, and even in the session before, it comes down to the completedness of the trail system, right? So Lyle finds himself, it sounds like Pace does, on a trail that has origins and destinations, right? It's kind of at its nexus of being complete, the movement and the behaviors and established. If you kind of cut back to 2007 or 8 or 9 when that thing was starting, the excitement about fronting this trail wasn't as great as what we're hearing right now. It was a burden. They wanted to be oriented towards streets and not the trail. They needed to see behaviors begin. They needed to see activity and sort of desire lines happen. And what had to happen between the time when we started segments of the trail being completed and to now is a high degree of programming in certain areas, much like what Pace was saying, these experiential things that were the attractors. You know, we're looking for differentiators for real estate. We're looking for reasons for people to rent there, for an office to locate there, for a restaurant to be there, and it's beyond just trips. It's got to be an experience. And so until the trail is complete, you need to begin to infill with perhaps some programming, bring in some events, or make things happen until the connections exist. I've seen a lot of trail segments where they just don't go anywhere, and it's hard to get the traction that we need. They may even be in great places, but it's hard to get the traction that you need for the developers to behave a certain way, to orient to the trail. They're just not. Sometimes they'll put their service areas toward an incomplete trail, and you've got to fight those battles. So the opportunities are really commensurate with how complete that thing is. And places like the Beltline, which have done a phenomenal job of tackling large chunks of that at once, are the ones, frankly, that really get successful and catalyzed quickly, or quicker than others.
Mm-hmm. So you did a great job of describing both opportunities related to fully completed trails or trails where big chunks have been created. Then you shared about the challenges of incomplete trails. So I'll just kind of open it up, and if others want to raise your hand, I'll call you out. What are some of the other difficulties you've had as a developer, challenges with these trails? I think, Warren, I'll go ahead and pick on you again, but I think you kind of mentioned that issue in terms of sales, right?
Yeah, well, just like when Lyles talks about, retail, Lyles is going to be there for 20 years owning that center. And so, he's building something up for a long time. When you're selling it, they're only looking now, the buyer's looking at what is it now? And, maybe they do get the appreciation when it gets completed. So they want to know what it's going to look like. If it's not finished, it's kind of hard to paint a picture of it. But I think, he brought up a good point. We have sections that are built and you got a little park area and you have event, but as we get into some of these other questions, the difficulty of these trails, unlike the Beltline, they're normally pieces of segments of land. They're either gone two ways. You see them either try to run around streams or creek outside the state buffer and be more of a greenway path, or an urban trail is more defined on probably more usable land. And it could be street corners and other things like even like dealing with utility companies trying to get a design, how an intersection works when you want to put a 12-foot or an 8-foot pathway that's part of a trail system gets very challenging in some of those urban areas. But having it complete is huge. I think, it's more difficult in the planning, more on an urban trail than obviously a trail that would be, along a greenway path that is what most of them are doing today.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any others? Difficulties, challenges?
I'll jump in just on a couple of things. On the Sugar Creek Greenway with Park Road, the Sugar Creek Greenway actually just runs on the other side of the stream from this big shopping center. And we were a big proponent of building a pedestrian bridge because the road that crosses over the sidewalk is pretty narrow, and we wanted to work with the county on creating a pedestrian bridge that kind of dropped into our shopping center, and they were on board with it. There was a big community forum that kind of went on, and that was like the #1 spot where the communities voted that they wanted access over to our shopping center because A, it's this old shopping center, it's very popular, but B, it also provides the ability for people to come park in our parking field and actually access the trail and kind of move back and forth. And once again, if that drives trips to your shopping center, then why wouldn't you ultimately want to do it? So we were going to contribute a significant amount of money towards the bridge, but we couldn't afford the whole bridge. And the county was going to extend the trail, but their pricing for the bridge actually came up about twice as much as what we felt like the bridge itself would cost. And they ultimately ended up cutting the bridge out of the overall program. And I suspect if there was a private-public partnership arrangement there where maybe the developer could take on the construction of the bridge, but also utilize some of the county funding, it might be done at a far less expensive rate. And then the only other thing is that I go back to the light rail system is that we're blessed with trail on both sides of the track. So you've got a good continual trail there. However, on our side, there's a couple of pieces. It's almost like teeth missing. It's just like the trail will go all the way up a bit, and then it stops for about 100 yards, and then it can go for another 200 yards, and then it stops for another 100 yards. And some form of public funding, because one's behind a car wash, and the car wash is not overly interested in having people walk behind the car wash, and unless you want to get your hair washed. But I think that the whole thing is that I think that if there would be some money for the continuation of the trail to kind of connect some stuff, it wouldn't be that expensive, but it certainly would extend the trail up just to have some money reserved off to the side for that.
Hey, Greg.
Yes.
I'd like to kind of comment on Lyle's comment. We find the same thing that he mentioned, that in the Alpharetta, when Kathy Cook was on, they have their impact fee credit. So if we build any of the trail system, we don't have to pay the impact fees, or they'll offset the cost of what we spent for the impact fees. But also they find in all these other, we've done some other improvements on trail systems that, they find out that we could probably do it, half the cost, maybe even more than that, than what they would pay to do it, because they got to get a qualified general contractor that's bonded, that's rated in their local jurisdiction. And so we can build it, probably for about half the cost, as long as we agree on the plan. So that's a good comment. That Bowles is probably right. If somebody would have done a private partnership, they probably could have got the bridge built, because it is a big difference when a developer's overseeing it than a city or local government.
Yeah, would anybody else like to comment on challenges like that or solutions?
The one thing that I've experienced on emerging trails that are being planned, that are intended to be built by the development community or the private sector, is the change in alignment of a particular trail because of whatever cost, environmental impact, and its effect on the development community understanding what's a given and what's not. So I've seen the interaction between the planning division of the trail and a developer on a pretty substantial property, and for some time, for months or maybe even a year, have a discussion about an alignment for a trail, and then that changes. And that unknown, it's like anything. It's like a roadway coming through your property, or it's like a transit line adjusting where a station may go. It really casts a doubt into the community's embrace, the development community's embrace of that particular asset, particularly if they're expected to pay for it. And so I think that the transparency of the dialogue is very important. The way in which it's funded, particularly if it's not set, needs to be equitable, and try to avoid as much as possible from shifting how and where that thing is going, so that we can rely upon its future connections. Very critical.
Thank you. Pace or Chris, do you have a particular headache you've encountered or thought on this issue?
We really don't, other than I would echo what we've heard already. The majority of both the Riverwalk in Columbus as well as the Dragonfly has been executed in a public-private partnership, and which has been talked about. I would echo that anything you can do to get it out of the municipality's hands, the better. And let them participate, but from the sidelines, and it just seems to help schedule and cost and all aspects of it. And that, at least that's been our experience in Columbus.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing and echo what the others are saying. The connectivity is kind of the biggest challenge. Where for the deals we've built on, or near the rail trail, they're super successful and get a huge benefit from it because of all the experience along the trail. The ones that we're building along future trails that are being connected, especially when we're doing our for sale projects, we don't necessarily see the benefits. Our future residents do down the road, but not necessarily when they're buying. So to the extent there's a way to, have visibility into when that connectivity is going to happen, it'd certainly help.
Thank you. So I'll kind of skip down to another question we had because it's tying in with the discussion. So funding's coming up on all of these issues, trails, developments. I think, Warren, you mentioned the credit on the impact fees. What are some other creative ways, or just the most common ways you're seeing funding occur for these urban trails? How is it spilling over into developers? Do you have any bright ideas you'd like to share, particularly with the trail leaders?
You're asking me?
Sure.
I think the impact fees is, a great trade-off that the city of Alpharetta has done. I know the Beltline, in Atlanta has just raised property taxes to fund, a lot of their future building. And I think the Beltline's done a great job of what they've done. I'm not saying there. I know a lot of cities have raised bonds in infrastructure credits, and there's been some other ways that some other jurisdictions have come to us about way to get things funded, but we've not participated in those yet. But anything that the local government could help offset developers' cost for either permits or, impact fees would be, and let them do it, would probably be, again, cheaper in the end.
And Richard will probably know, and Chris will know a little bit about this, but when we did the Atherton project, the way that CATS incentivized us to build the trail, other than telling us to do it, was our property line actually went to the center of the railroad tracks that they were running up and down. So they had the rights. Of course, there was an easement there for the train to go back and forth, the light rail to go back and forth, but they had right of way that extended deep into our project. So as part of the overall project, and we didn't have any problem building it, but we swapped property ownership and they gave back right of way, which actually expanded the footprint from which we could actually develop the property. So that was, of course, of benefit to us, and then therefore we could extend the trail through, which is what we wanted to do.
Yeah, a lot of that on the rail trail was built from the transportation bonds for the light rail, right? And it was sold as it was abutting the trail, or as abutting the rail line. It was sold as emergency access to the rail line for maintenance and for emergencies, so it could be funded back then. And that was a creative source. And then for completion of many of the trails in our region, bonds have been raised from a public side. And then that in concert with negotiations with developers to build the segments and the gaps. I haven't seen any TIGs or TIFs being used for that. There's been districts that we've been involved in that have TIFs that you could say that the offset has been used to afford things like the trail connections, but not directly. It's mostly been bonds.
Has anyone seen municipalities or local governments issue green bonds specifically for urban trails or adjacent parks, interior developments?
Not specific to a development.
Yeah, I know that's starting to pick up on some suburban cities that have massive, they're trying to save green space quickly.
Right.
Hey, Greg, I know several projects in Atlanta. If it's a road project, but if you're adding a bike lane to a road project, you can get federal funds. So, I mean, a lot of these trail systems obviously carry bikes. There may be things in the future, but so you see a lot of these jurisdictions doing that now, putting bike lanes in, but they can get it paid for through federal funds.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, Tiger grants used to be pretty big. Tiger grants used to be pretty big of doing multimodal facilities that could be, cycle tracks or trails that go through suburban areas or urban.
So Pace, down in Columbus, how was the funding for all of the trails pretty much?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's probably very counter to the previous comments. The majority of our trail system has been funded by the philanthropic community. And we have a very robust philanthropic community in Columbus, and the original design of the Columbus Riverwalk was really in an effort to solve a sewer problem. Under the Riverwalk is the main sewer system for Columbus along the Chattahoochee. But the majority of that and the Dragonfly Trail that extends kind of east-west off of that has been vastly funded through the philanthropic community. And it's interesting, I was going to mention that when you mentioned preserving green space. There are a number of philanthropic grants, as well as family foundations, et cetera, that focus a lot on green space, and I think can provide a potential funding source for not only parks but greenways and trails and stuff like that. That's how we have funded the majority of what we have in Columbus.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to go back to what's near and dear to all of your hearts. What type of value creation? I think Lyle kind of touched upon it, certainly with the retail sales, but do you feel like you've noticed or just have a sense of or actually can quantify on your projects? Richard, do you want to share any you've seen or thoughts? And
Yeah,
I'll call out folks.
on completed trails in our region, we've seen up to 25% premiums on residential rents. That would be on the Little Sugar Creek Greenway and the rail trail. It's hard to quantify it just for the rail trail because it's got transit. There's a lot of amenities and assets that have been invested in for that corridor. So it's hard to pinpoint that as for the trail. But on Little Sugar Creek Greenway, which was through a natural system in Midtown, they were seeing 25% rent premiums on the trail side of that development. And it's full, it's complete, it's enlivened, and it's proven its value for sure.
Mm-hmm. So quite substantial. Chris?
Yeah, I don't quite have the same analytics that Richard and Lyle do, but I'll tell you what I've noticed is that over time, the use of these trails has gone up drastically, especially when they're fully connected. And so as a seller of a property on one of those trails or a buyer, you can anticipate that traffic to continue to improve, and that drives more traffic to apartment communities. So essentially what that does is help support rent appreciation and cap rate compression a little bit. It's hard to quantify it though, but it helps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, like I said earlier, I don't know about the cap rate compression, maybe a little bit, but if it does, well, if it does a couple of things, if it proves out from a sales standpoint that it helps, then ultimately more sales they do, and then hopefully the more rent that you can get, and therefore the higher the value of your shopping center. But also if you orient your shopping center or orient towards the rail trail, like I said, we talked about earlier, and Pace was talking about it, is like if that can be ultimately a gathering spot and an amenity and where people hang out, then there's an emotional value that kind of comes with it that you can't quantify from a cap rate standpoint, but people will see it and understand it, and that might help with the value as well.
Mm-hmm. So Pace, your firm has done many different types of uses along these trails, hotels, office. What have you noticed? Or is most of your product long-term hold, or do you sell some of it or mix it up?
Yeah, and I think that's going to drive the answer is the question that you just asked. So a little bit of the Cliff Note history on Bradley Company. We're a 136-year-old privately held company. So we have 142 family members. We're 6 generations deep now in family members. So our investment philosophy tends to be a little bit different in that we take literally a generational approach to it. And so while we have certainly seen the upside and the benefit of the experience that I alluded to earlier and driving value, a lot of it is also focused on value preservation and protection. Most of our assets we do not sell. I've been with the company 4 years and we haven't sold an asset yet in 4 years. Prior to that, we'd only sold one in the last 10. So most of our investment is very, very long-term, like I said, generational. Our most recent project, which is a multifamily project we opened in downtown on the Riverwalk, is a 226 unit podium style apartment complex with about 16,000 feet of ground floor retail. And Columbus historically has been an 85 to 90 cent multifamily rental market on a per square foot basis. That project today is at $1.70 a square foot. So it's a different product for Columbus, and I certainly wouldn't attribute that entirely to the trail. We also sit immediately on the Chattahoochee River, so we've got river views, we've got trail access. We built a central park that is the hub, the center experience piece for what is ultimately a 7.5 acre big mixed use development. So I think that clearly is part of it, being in the heart of downtown, on the river walk. Again, I don't know that that drives all of that value and rent appreciation, but it certainly drives some of it.
Yeah,
So asset preservation.
to Pace's comment, maybe to Beth. Oh, I'm just sorry, just kind of to Pace's point. I think Beth texted in something real quick, but it certainly is easier to invest in something like this if you have a long-term hold approach to it, because sooner or later you absolutely will see the value of it. But if you're a merchant build type thing, it may not make sense to invest in that as much sense.
Right. So like I've got another question here from the audience from Beth. It says, when does it become cost prohibitive? Imagine a high finished system like the Indianapolis Cultural Trail. Would you see enough value in that to build that public investment on your property? Is there a difference in the return on investment, say on a residential property versus a commercial? There's a lot of questions in there, but I'm going to just throw it out there for discussion.
Greg, so I was going to answer the other question a little bit. On the residential side, I don't know if you see the value. I think we've probably seen 10 to maybe 15% more value. But in the residential side, it's this amenity that nobody else has. Normally your competition won't have it. So you do pick up speed and volume. And when you pick up speed and volume in a residential project, it compounds, obviously, how fast you get out of it. So I think, it being a huge amenity that maybe the guy down the street doesn't have, I think is a big point. So, the difference on the residential development, rather than Lyle's or the Bradley companies, that, we got to look at just that improvement on that one asset and those ever how many units there are, and that's all you have. So you sometimes don't know the value of what you would sell until you get finished, if that makes sense. And so you got to commit to build it up front and commit to spend the money up front for the trail system, but you really don't know what you're going to get for it on a for sale, because it still has to appraise. They still have to get a loan. So, there's not an appraisals index that says if you're on a trail or not a trail, it's worth 10% more or so. And so it's very challenging on the residential basis. But if you're in a long-term position, it's easier to justify that money over time, probably, and especially if you get increased rents and, in a commercial center, increase, your rent rates, over time.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
Anyone else want to speak to this issue of value creation and the differences with the property types? Okay, so we got another question from the audience. It's from Jennifer Pharr Davis. Says, what is the most challenging trail regulation or feature to deal with as a developer? What, when a municipality or a trail association wants something, what really, is a big challenge for you that you can think of?
I'll tell you, for us here in Columbus, and we're probably not alone, a lot of it boils down to, you can find the money publicly or privately to build the trail. You struggle to find the money to maintain the trail. And, a half-baked trail that ultimately starts to fall apart is not worth anything. And so that to me would be the biggest challenge, is making sure that it's appropriately funded so that there is maintenance, dollars to handle maintenance for decades in most cases. Because if you don't, and it starts to fall apart, it then becomes a detriment and not an asset.
Great point.
Greg, I would say, as we mentioned earlier, is that, the design and engineering, if you've got a creek, like running up the Chattahoochee River. If you're in the city of Atlanta, you got to deal with ARC. So you got impervious calculations that you got to count. So actually, if you're in Atlanta and ARC, if you put a trail system in, it's going to go against your developable amount of property that you have. Again, with, pathways or sidewalk systems within existing road easements or right-of-way corridors, getting the utility company to do anything today is like, getting an act of Congress to, if you got to move a pole or move any utilities, is very difficult to do any of that.
Yeah, somebody brought up in the previous panel about, I guess, with the light rail, and it might have been Beth. I'm not quite sure, but talking about how with the light rail trail, how they've kind of let the ownership there kind of free flow. If somebody wants to put some artwork there, then it just kind of happens to go there. It's regulated and do whatever. And I think that we have a farmer's market that pops up on our trail every Saturday. And I mean, it just makes sense to do something like that. But I think that being too restrictive on what happens with a trail probably could be a real hindrance to how successful the trail can be, because the trail ownership should be kind of not only the developers, but also the patrons. I mean, up to a point. So I can see how that could be a problem, but it's not we're fortunate it's not a problem with where we are.
Yeah, we had talked about the rail trail being a culture of creative action. And when we developed that vision where you ask for forgiveness later, we were trying to get the community to really embrace it and make it their own. And that definitely causes some challenges. It raises some eyebrows and about art showing up, and was it scrutinized, or did it go through a committee to choose what is appropriate and what's not? But that's the beauty, I think, of some of them. You wouldn't see that necessarily on the High Line. You wouldn't see that on, Beth mentioned the Indianapolis Cultural Trail, which is a extremely curated, high finished space. But for the rail trail, it's just right? There's a little bit of grit, a little bit of nothing's really perfect, absolutely perfect along every part of that. It changes and it has a dynamic. I think that's one, Greg, one of the challenges is there's a one size fits all mentality in a lot of these facilities. And the trail, the trail dimensions and the separated ped and bike and the widths of these things, they start getting massive. I mean, there's some trail systems that are wider than streets now because they have facilities for volume of cyclists and scooters and motorized bikes and that impact that they're trying to anticipate, as well as pedestrians and moms with their strollers. And these things are starting to get 50 feet wide. So that's real estate, that's real number from a volume and density. But it doesn't need to be that everywhere, right? So if you start translating that cross section through what Lyle just did, or probably what Pace has done in certain moments that are a bit more compressed, it blows it out. You can't do that. So a lot of times in regulations, there's kind of cross sections that you need to, and again, it's much like a street, you just can't apply the same thing everywhere. And you have to ensure that your policies allow for that. You need to ensure that those that are managing that are looking at it in a context sensitive way.
Mm-hmm. Great points. I want to remind the audience to start sending in your questions. We've got some here, so I'm going to start rolling into them, giving our time. One question I have here from the audience is, have any of you really experienced NIMBY challenges? Not in my backyard.
Man, don't get me started on the NIMBY bit. It drives me crazy. And I think that I have been in Charlotte and Atlanta with the Beltline has been blessed with a community that actually supports it and sees the benefits of it. And you come across certain communities and it's like We don't want it. It's going to bring crime up the way and whatever. And I have gotten on my soapbox and tried to preach about all these great trails, Swamp Rabbit Trail in Greenville, all over Grapevine Trail. It's such an amenity to the community, and it's almost as if it's my pet peeve. It's almost as if there should be a bus tour of successful trails kind of in the region to get people to get on board. But it's a real problem. I'll have to tip my hat to Charlotte, is in that they have fully embraced any kind of funding measure to kind of help extend stuff like this and make it viable because they see the benefits.
Communication.
Bus tours.
Anybody else with a NIMBY challenge you want to mention? Okay, I'll go a little into another possible area you may have heard. The question here is, how about the trails are for nature, not commerce argument? Has anybody experienced that?
Well, in planning them for sure, you have many factions of people that come out. Some that are avid cyclists that want them for mobility only. Some of them are development communities that want them to have a diverse offering and amenity for their project. The naturalists, these things go through so many different types of biomes and communities. Again, most of them can support all of the objectives. I mean, Beltline supports all of those objectives. Swamp Rabbit does. The successful ones that are planned properly move people to a node where it becomes urbanized and active. And then it has a cadence to it. It has a flow, an ebb and a flow of speed with which people go through it, stop and pause, become a voyeur, do some shopping, and then hit nature. And so, yes, they have an extreme benefit if you can intersect them with the natural world and have it sort of this holistic experience. But to assume that that's the only, they have to get paid for. They have to generate an economic advantage in order to offset the cost of implementation. So somewhere something needs to get built and tap into it to make it viable, I think.
Great points. Any other comments on trails are for nature, not commerce? Does anybody else experience that or have a perspective?
I think it's pretty obvious what's for commerce and what's for nature. And if you can actually blend the both, like Richard was talking about, that's a really nice. Sugar Creek probably does a really good job of blending that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe this kind of segues into one of the questions we had. In terms of design and innovation, what do you think is needed to improve urban trails next to real estate developments? These are kind of cutting edge things we heard, like Clyde was mentioning, conduit under the trail. I'm just kind of curious what ideas you as developers have in mind that's needed in terms of innovation or design. So Richard, I'll start with you, given your background. What are some of the things you would like to see?
Well, some folks might not think this is the right path, but to me, we've studied pretty extensively the effect of digital on placemaking and how there's a line that's blurred between virtual and real. And trails are that moment where we can get out and be immersed in nature, and I think that is very purposeful. I think there's moments on it where digital becomes a pretty easy manipulation of an environment to create a dynamic place. And I've seen, not necessarily on just urban trails. I mean, China does it pretty well. I've been to places in Suzhou and Beijing that transform place, the experience that you travel through digitally. And that's whether or not it's wayfinding or whether or not it reacts to the passerby or it changes color or it's art that interacts with you as you come through the space. I think that is a interesting way to add a level of dynamics to public realm that we haven't tapped. That can happen on Main Street, that can happen in shopping centers, that can happen on urban portions of trails where there is this interface of those two worlds. And I think we're going to get closer, continue to get closer of blurring that line. And so when we think about public infrastructure, sometimes I think it's purposeful to have that dialogue and see if there's a way to which that can add value.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anybody else have some innovative ideas or
Richard,
design?
isn't it similar to like something like that up in Quebec? You know, where they really have got a big interactive.
There are a lot of parks and spaces that use digital, and Toronto has it on their waterfront. There's some digital moments. You know, we experienced it at the Charlotte Shout Festival, which was an immersive digital thing that, but yeah, there's places that do it that just aren't on urban trails, right? They're more in public parks or city blocks, but you can see it translate to this. And I think what we've seen is from a wayfinding and people's reliance on navigation, that the interface of wayfinding with a rail trail or an urban trail becomes digital rather than analog. And so there's some pretty interesting stuff out there that makes them, adds another level or dimension to your experience.
To what pace ended up doing is that trails can become very linear and you just move so fast, and it's like the enforcement of pocket areas. I think, Greg, you were talking about it, the Beltline, where they've got little parks you can step off and do some stuff, or any place to kind of pause and kind of hang out and then move on down the trail if you want to. I think that's not innovative. It's just almost should be like a little requirement if possible.
Kind of like a rest area along the trail.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the interesting piece about that for us has really been centered around focusing on how that interaction between the private development piece and the trail happens. And, you know, the centerpiece, as I mentioned earlier, for one of our uptown developments is a 1 acre park that by all standards is a pretty basic park, but it is the interaction point. It's the intersection point between the private property and the Riverwalk. And unless you stop and focus on it, what it's really designed to do is control that interaction. So it is there is a water feature that forces you to stop. And there is a meandering sidewalk that feeds from the park to the Riverwalk that is both pedestrian and designed for bicycles. But it forces you to weave and slow down to help protect that interaction point between the private property and, you know, the north-south, quickly moving, in some cases, Riverwalk. And so I think really focusing, I also think, you know, the Beltline where it intersects with Ponce City Market is really well done.
Very well.
And it creates a unique place. One, it grabs your attention and it focuses you on stopping, but it also may hold your attention, and it physically protects the intersection of private and public trailway.
Mm-hmm. So we're starting to get towards the tail end of our time. So I want to make sure I ask this question because the urban trail leaders had this posed to them. So, you know, what do you have a favorite urban trail or design within a development? And if so, why? You know, what do you really like as a developer in terms of an urban trail? And Pace, I'll address with you because you've got many, you know, down there, and all your projects are along them. Is there certain aspects or certain area you like the most?
It's an interesting question. I think Columbus has done a very good job of figuring out how to integrate the trail with the town as a whole, setting aside the real estate aspect of it entirely, and really making it a centerpiece and a building block for Columbus as a whole. It certainly is not the Beltline yet. We hope at someday it could get to that level. From a personal standpoint, I am a huge fan of the High Line in New York, and I'll tell you why. Is I think what I really like about it, and what I find appealing about it, is to me it's an interesting blend of pedestrian trail and art, and I mean that in terms of literal art in some cases, landscaping art in other cases, and I think it's just a unique, very well done urban trail. Yes, it's not in Columbus, I understand that, but still, I think it's uniquely special because it does blend a number of different components. And part of that we've tried to bring to Columbus. The foot of our brand new Hotel Indigo also sits on the Columbus Riverwalk, and we have preserved about a 12-foot high wall that actually holds up the swimming pool for the Indigo as a showcase for public art. And we actually partner with Columbus State University, with Becca Zajac at the Dragonfly, and we have essentially rotating art exhibits that get displayed on that wall that front right on the Riverwalk. And we change those out again in conjunction with the Columbus State University art students. So trying on a smaller scale to kind of blend public art and public, trailways.
Sounds awesome. Chris, do you have one that you would single out?
Yeah, I would act. I was going to say the same thing. The High Line is a perfect example to me. From living in New York, of a trail that was programmed and built in a way that really attracted just a ton of pedestrian interaction and a ton of development around it. So you have, based like you were saying, excellent landscaping, excellent art, architecture of all the buildings around it and have been built over it are just fascinating, and just really impressed with how that was done. And it's a good example for other places.
Thank you. Warren? I think you're on mute. There you go.
Well, a kind of hard subject for me. I've had Kathy on here and also the Beltline. So, I think the Beltline in Atlanta has been a great project. I think there's a question a while ago about what can you do to help these projects and how they get designed. And the Beltline has done a great job. But the Beltline, if you have any property near the Beltline, you basically work with them on your plan. They have to basically go through the zoning process. And what was unique about that is that we pretty much have designed a section of the Beltline with our project and grades. And we've done the same thing in Alpharetta. And so, but I think, obviously, I think the Beltline is just a unique deal because it's a, track system, and it's not piecemeal together. But Alpharetta's doing a great job on theirs, but I think the Beltline's really a special deal.
Thank you. Richard?
I think I want to
Been
go
around the world.
I think I want to go to Columbus and check that one out. That one sounds fabulous. I haven't seen it. My favorite experience I've ever had on a trail system, and it's really not known as a trail system. It's how the city works, is in Vancouver, the Cole Harbor Quay. And so if you go along the waterfront from like Gastown past the convention center, it's a bikeway that changes along. It's very urban. And it changes pretty dramatically, but the compression of experiences and then the moment of pause and the compression of experiences is very well done. And along probably 5-6 miles of this thing, you'll have sort of a vibrant food and beverage core. You'll go by the pretty dynamic convention center, which is a park-like, plaza-like setting. You'll have a nice passive Harbor Green Park. You'll have the marina that you go by, the Bayshore Coal Harbor Marina. You'll go by the historic Vancouver Rowing Club. Hit the aquarium, and then Stanley Park is this nature preserve that is about a 3-mile loop with beaches and woods. So you get, in a really short amount of time, a lot of stimulus, and it's simple. It's not overthought. It functions well, and it mixes the modes of traffic, pedestrians, bikes, scooters, very well. It's a good experience.
Great. I'm ready to go. So Lyle?
I will say, Richard, that I've been on the part of the Stanley Park Trail in Vancouver, and if anybody's still watching this, go to Vancouver no matter what it takes, and go to Stanley Park, because it is fantastic. But it was very neat. I've never met a trail I don't like. And anytime I go to a city, and I literally was in Dallas a couple of weeks ago and hit the Grapevine. I was in Memorial Park last weekend in Houston. Anytime I get the opportunity to go see kind of how some of this stuff is done, I'll do it. And I'll say that we did at Atherton, we did tear a page out of the High Line. And if you haven't been to the High Line, you've got to go do that. And we actually mimic some features that they had, some bleacher seatings and some other stuff like that for some gathering spots, and what it was that we did with Atherton. So it's pretty spectacular. And the story behind how that ultimately came to be built is really kind of neat. A real sleeper, and Richard talked about it earlier, is the Swamp Rabbit Trail in Greenville. And it is a mix of beautiful nature. You go through Furman's campus and you kind of follow along this. There's areas where you don't even realize the city's around you. Then they go through some areas that had some really tough industrial type stuff. I think they started to clean up, and then it ends up right now in downtown Greenville, and then kind of moves through there to places beyond. And it's a mix of the nature, and there's not a ton of commerce, but it's the way they've integrated it into downtown is it's quietly one of the best ones I've ever been a part of.
Great. So kind of going all over North America here. So we got 5 more minutes. So I'm going to do a quick one here. Last one from the audience. It's from Beth. Says, thinking about the future of transportation, autonomous vehicles, e-bikes, scooters, are you planning for these changes in your developments? Similar to the future-proofing thoughts that, Clyde mentioned earlier on. Anybody want to speak to the future of transportation and how it's tying in with these trails and your developments?
I'll just start real quick, because I know that us, along with Richard, we kind of dealt with this at Atherton. But if you're trying to, and Pace, you may have run into this too, but I think that the speed these scooters kind of go through up and down these trails is almost alarming. And the electric scooters themselves, and which I like it, and I love the fact that you can get from point A to point B in a long distance in a really short time. But if you're really trying to create an environment where people are going to slow down and hang out, that creates a issue. So, you can't put speed bumps in there. You can't do whatever. But I think that we put some bollards in to kind of help slow things down just a touch, where people have to think about it, and it's almost natural to want to pause instead of ripping through a certain area. And not just slowing things down so that people really kind of consider the moment that you hope you're trying to create.
Vancouver has the issue with a lot of cyclists, and so you just have zones that people have to get off their bikes and walk. And I think for more mechanized forms of transportation, there needs to be a bypass for the through movement. And so to the point, you're going to have to start thinking about facilities that perhaps go around the action and not through it, and then have your experience that goes through it. Parking for those things, those that have scooters, the bird scooters, or all of those scooter shares, they're all over the place. And so there has to be protocols and standards for along these assets of parking areas, designated parking areas, maintenance. You see bike maintenance moments that show up on trails. So I think you're going to see some of that. But yeah, what you don't want is like how we handle transportation and just add lanes, right? I don't need now a 50-foot wide thing to grow to 70 feet wide, so I have more travel lanes for all these different modes. You sometimes have to separate at certain periods.
Any other thoughts on the future transportation impacting your projects?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll weigh in, and we've been, I guess you'd consider it fortunate. We have avoided the bird and lime scooter phenomenon in Columbus, at least for the most part now. Not that it won't come later, but relative to the broader question around kind of future-proofing developments, it's I guess interesting timing. We're literally in the midst of designing the next two phases of the project where Indigo is, which will be a 250,000 foot office building and another 250 units of multifamily. And so we're going through a lot of that kind of future proofing think, if you will, at the moment. We've integrated a very large bike storage facility that'll be in the multifamily, obviously providing electronic or charging stations rather for electronic cars. All of those things are having to be taken into consideration now for even for a town the size of Columbus, which is really up until now was never an issue. But I think with the onset of the Riverwalk and the Dragonfly Trail and the number of people that are using bikes as their, in most cases, primary mode of transportation, it's become a necessity. And trying to figure out how you plan for it and where you put them in your projects is vitally important.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for your participation. I've thoroughly enjoyed the discussion, and I hope the trail leaders have picked up some wonderful tips from you, and that both groups, whether it's urban trail leaders or developers along the trails, are able to continue to work together to build better cities. As you know, this is the City Builders program of Auburn University's Masters of Real Estate Development program. And we're just grateful and thankful for all you're doing to build better cities wherever you are. So a big shout out and a big war eagle to all of you. And I'm going to turn it over to Kim Curtin to close us out.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you all for joining us this evening. And I hope you'll be able to join us in the fall for some of our future events. We have an annual guest speaker series and some topical webinars that we'll be offering. And you can find out more about these and other events by visiting our website at citybuilders.auburn.edu. So thanks again. Have a great evening, and War Eagle.
War Eagle.
War Eagle.
Thank you.
Thank you.